high in the Andes, where the air thins and the mountains hold their breath. A single golden disc once hung in a temple, so sacred that only the emperor himself could enter, a reflection of the sun, the source of all Inca power, the light from which an entire civilization believed it was born. This is a story that stretches across centuries, from a small kingdom in a highland valley to an empire spanning thousands of miles, built without wheels, without iron, without written words as we know them, and yet somehow, impossibly, enduring. If these quiet histories help carry you toward rest, staying subscribed means more of them will find their way to you in the nights ahead. The Inca called themselves the children of the sun, and their story begins, as all such stories must, with a myth wrapped around a mountain. And so we can begin there. And so we come now to the very beginning, to the stories that the Inca people told themselves about where they came from, and how their great civilization first took root in the high valleys of the Andes. These are old stories, passed down through generations of storytellers and court historians, and they carry within them the seeds of everything the Inca Empire would eventually become. The exact year is difficult to pin down with certainty, as is often the case with ancient founding myths, but scholars generally place these legendary events somewhere around the year 1200 of the Common Era, give or take a generation or two. This was a time when the Andes were home to many small kingdoms and chiefdoms, each with their own traditions and their own claims to the land, and the Inca were just one group among many, not yet the mighty empire builders they would later become. The most widely known version of the Inca origin story begins at Lake Titicaca, that vast and impossibly blue body of water that sits high in the mountains on the border of what is now Peru and Bolivia. Lake Titicaca is one of the highest navigable lakes in the world, resting at an altitude of more than 12,000 feet above sea level, and its waters have been considered sacred by Andean peoples for thousands of years. The air is thin up there, and the light has a particular quality, sharp and clear in a way that makes the sky seem very close indeed. It was from this extraordinary place, according to the legend, that the founders of the Inca dynasty emerged, sent forth on a divine mission by the sun god Inti himself. Inti was the supreme deity of the Inca pantheon, the giver of warmth and light, the force that made crops grow and sustained all life in the high mountain valleys. The Inca believed that Inti looked down upon the earth and saw that the people living there were in a state of barbarism and disorder, lacking the knowledge of agriculture and civilization that would allow them to flourish. And so, moved by compassion for these struggling humans, Inti decided to send two of his children down to earth to teach the people how to live properly, how to cultivate the land, how to weave cloth, and how to organize themselves into a proper society. These two divine children were Manco Cápac and Mama Oclo, brother and sister, husband and wife, as was the custom among Inca royalty in later times. They emerged from the waters of Lake Titicaca, or perhaps from an island within the lake. Accounts vary slightly on this detail, and they carried with them the authority of the sun god and a sacred mission to civilize the world. Manco Cápac was to be the first Sapa Inca, the supreme ruler, while Mama Oclo would be the first Koya, or queen, and together they would establish the dynasty that would one day rule over millions of people across the length of the Andes. Before they set out on their journey, Inti gave to Manco Cápac a special golden staff, known as the Qhapaq Yori. This staff was not merely a symbol of royal authority, though it was certainly that as well, but served a very practical divine purpose. Inti instructed his children to travel across the land, testing the soil as they went by, plunging the golden staff into the earth. In most places, the staff would simply rest on the surface or sink only a little way, indicating that the ground was not suitable for their purposes. But when they found the right place, the place that Inti had chosen for them, the staff would sink completely into the earth with no resistance at all, swallowed up by the fertile soil. That would be the sign that they had found the location where they should establish their capital city and begin their great work of civilization. And so Manco Cápac and Mama Oclo began their long journey northward from Lake Titicaca, walking through the high mountain valleys and testing the earth as they went. One can imagine them moving slowly through that dramatic landscape, past snow-capped peaks and deep gorges, through grasslands where llamas and alpacas grazed, across rivers fed by glacial meltwater. At each promising location, they stopped and tested the soil with the golden staff. But each time the staff refused to sink, and they knew they must continue on their way. This went on for some considerable time, as they searched for the place that their father the sun had destined for them. Finally, after much traveling, they came to a beautiful valley surrounded by mountains, a place where the climate was mild and the soil looked rich and dark. Manco Cápac took the Qhapaq yori and thrust it into the ground, and this time the staff sank immediately and completely into the earth, disappearing from sight. They had found the place. This valley would become the site of Cusco, the capital of the Inca Empire, the city that the Inca would call the navel of the world. The name Cusco itself comes from a Quechua word, meaning something like center or navel, reflecting the Inca belief that their capital was the very middle point of the universe, the place from which all order and civilization radiated outward. Now, there exists another version of the Inca origin story, somewhat different in its details, but carrying many of the same themes. And this alternative legend centers not on Lake Titicaca, but on a place called Pachacuti, which lies some miles to the south of Cusco. Pachacuti means something like Inn of the Dawn, or place of origin in Quechua. And it was here, according to this second tradition, that the ancestors of the Inca emerged from a series of caves known collectively as Tambo Toco. In this version of the story, there were not 2 but 8 original ancestors, 4 brothers and 4 sisters, who came forth from 3 separate cave openings at Tambo Toco. The central cave, which was considered the most important, was called Qhapaq Toco, the rich or noble window, and it was from this opening that the 4 brothers emerged. Their names were Ayar Manco, who would later become known as Manco Cápac, along with Ayar Cachi, Ayar Uchu, and Ayar Uka. Each of these names carries meaning, with Cachi referring to salt, Uchu to chili pepper, and Oka to warrior or enemy, though the precise significance of these names is not entirely certain. The 4 sisters emerged from the 2 side caves, which were called Maras Toco and Sutik Toco, and their names were Mama Oclo, Mama Huaco, Mama Ipakura, and Mama Rawa. Together, these 8 ancestors set out from Pachacuti to find a place where they could settle and establish their kingdom. Much as in the Lake Titicaca version of the story, they were accompanied by a number of followers from the local population who recognized their divine nature and chose to join them on their journey. However, the journey from Tambo Toco was not a peaceful one, for troubles arose among the brothers almost from the beginning. Ayar Cachi, it seems, was possessed of extraordinary strength and power, able to hurl stones from his sling with such force that he could flatten mountains and carve out valleys. This made his brothers deeply uneasy, for they feared that Ayakachi might use his powers to dominate them all, and they grew jealous of his abilities. And so, according to the legend, the other three brothers devised a plan to rid themselves of their troublesome sibling. They convinced Ayakachi that he had left behind some important items in the cave at Tambo Toko, golden vessels and other sacred objects that would be needed for the founding of their new kingdom. Would he not go back and retrieve them? They asked, as he was the strongest and fastest among them. Ayakachi agreed and returned to the cave, and as soon as he had entered, his brothers sealed the entrance behind him with great stones, trapping him inside forever. It is said that Ayakachi struggled mightily to escape, and the earthquakes that occasionally shake the Andes are attributed to his continued efforts to break free from his underground prison. With Ayakachi removed, the remaining brothers and four sisters continued their journey, but they too would not all reach the final destination. Ayauchu was turned to stone at a place called Huanakori, becoming a sacred huaca or shrine that would be venerated by later generations of Inca. Ayaroka flew ahead to the site of future Cusco and was also turned to stone there, marking the place where the city should be built. And so in the end, it was Manco alone among the brothers, now taking the name Manco Cápac, who arrived in the fertile valley with the four sisters to establish the Inca kingdom. Whether one follows the Lake Titicaca version or the Tambo Toko version, the story arrives at the same point, with Manco Cápac and his companions settling in the valley of Cusco and beginning the work of building their civilization. The Inca took these origin stories very seriously, and they continued to venerate Lake Titicaca and Pachacuti as sacred places throughout the existence of their empire. Pilgrimages were made to both locations, and elaborate ceremonies were performed to honor the ancestors who had emerged from these places at the beginning of time. The connection to the sun god Inti was absolutely central to Inca identity and to the legitimacy of Inca rule. Because Manco Cápac and Mama Ocllo were children of the sun, their descendants, the Sapa Incas who would rule the empire, were also considered to be divine beings, literally related to the sun through their bloodline. This is why the Inca royalty referred to themselves as the Children of the Sun, a title that carried both religious and political significance. It meant that the Sapa Inca was not merely a king chosen by other humans, but a god on earth, the living representative of Inti among the people. This divine status had important practical implications for how the empire was governed. The Sapa Inca's commands were not simply orders from a powerful ruler, they were the will of the sun made manifest on earth. To disobey the Inca was to defy the sun itself, a form of cosmic rebellion. This gave the Inca rulers an extraordinary degree of authority, backed not just by military force, but by the deeply held religious beliefs of their subjects. The sun itself was worshipped through elaborate rituals and magnificent temples, the most famous of which would eventually be the Coricanchar in Cusco, whose walls were said to be covered in sheets of gold to catch and reflect the light of Inti. Gold was considered to be the sweat of the sun, while silver was the tears of the moon, and these precious metals were used extensively in religious contexts rather than as currency or for personal adornment. Yet, for all the grandeur that the Inca would eventually achieve, it is worth remembering that the early days of their civilization were remarkably modest. For nearly 200 years after the legendary founding by Manco Cápac, the Inca controlled only a small territory, extending perhaps 25 miles or so in any direction from Cusco. They were a small highland kingdom among many, not particularly more powerful or impressive than their neighbors, engaged in the same local rivalries and struggles for resources that characterized Andean politics of the period. During these early centuries, from roughly 1200 to 1400 of the Common Era, the Inca were led by a succession of rulers who are now referred to as the legendary or mythical Incas, as very little historical information about them has survived. Their names are preserved in king lists compiled after the Spanish conquest, and there were said to be 8 of them between Manco Cápac and the Inca Viracocha, who ruled in the early 15th century. What these early rulers actually accomplished, what wars they fought, what buildings they constructed, remains largely unknown, shrouded in the mists of time and the distortions of later myth-making. What we can say is that during this long period of relative obscurity, the Inca were developing the cultural, religious, and political institutions that would later allow them to build their empire. They were learning how to farm the challenging terrain of the high Andes, how to manage water resources, how to organize labor for large construction projects, and how to incorporate other groups into their society. The Cusco Valley, with its fertile soil, mild climate, and central location, provided an excellent base for these developments, just as the golden staff of Manco Cápac had promised it would. And so the children of the sun waited in their valley, honoring their divine ancestor, Inti, maintaining the traditions passed down from Manco Cápac and Mama Oclo, growing slowly stronger over the generations, until the time came for them to emerge from their mountain homeland and reshape the world of the Andes forever. But that time had not yet arrived, and for now, the Inca remained a small people in a small kingdom, their future greatness still hidden, like the golden staff, beneath the fertile earth of Cusco. In the long and layered history of the Inca Empire, there is perhaps no figure more central to its transformation from a modest highland kingdom into the largest empire the Americas had ever known than the ruler who came to be called Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui. His reign, which scholars generally place between the years 1438 and 1471 of the Common Era, represents a period of such profound change that the very name he took upon assuming power speaks to the magnitude of what he accomplished. For Pachacuti means something like earthshaker, or perhaps more poetically, he who remakes the world. And this is precisely what he set about doing during his more than 3 decades of rule. To understand how this transformation came about, we must first return to the circumstances of his rise to power, which began not in triumph, but in crisis. During a moment when the very survival of the Inca people seemed uncertain. Before Pachacuti took his famous name, he was known as Cusi Yupanqui, a younger son of the ruling Sapo Inca called Viracocha Inca. The Inca state at this time, while certainly a power to be, reckoned with in the Cusco Valley and its immediate surroundings, had not yet begun its remarkable expansion across the Andes. It was one kingdom among several in the highlands, and its neighbors included peoples who were themselves ambitious and militarily capable. Among these neighbors were the Chunka, a confederation of communities located to the northwest of Cusco, in the region around what is now Andahuaylas, and it was the Chunka who would provide the catalyst for everything that followed. The relationship between the Inca and the Chunka had been uneasy for some time, as tends to happen when two powers of roughly similar strength share overlapping spheres of influence, and this unease eventually erupted into open warfare. The Chunka invasion, which various sources place around the year 1438. Though, as with many events in pre-Columbian Andean history, the precise dating remains a subject of scholarly discussion, represented an existential threat to the Inca state. The Chunka forces, by all accounts substantial in number and confident in their military capability, advanced toward Cusco itself, the sacred heart of the Inca world. And it was in response to this advance that a remarkable thing happened, or perhaps failed to happen, depending on how one interprets the historical record. The ruling Super Inca, Viracocha Inca, who had led successful campaigns earlier in his reign and had overseen a period of modest expansion, made the decision to withdraw from Cusco rather than defend it directly against the approaching Chunka army. He retreated to a fortress called Sacsayhuamán, taking with him his chosen heir, a son named Inca Urcon, and leaving the defense of the capital to whoever might choose to remain. It was in this moment of crisis that Qhapaq, who had not been designated as his father's successor, and who was by some accounts not particularly favored at court, chose to stay and organize the defense of the city. The sources, which admittedly come to us through the filter of later Inca state ideology and Spanish colonial interpretation, describe the young prince rallying those warriors and nobles who had not fled, preparing what defenses could be prepared, and facing the Chunka assault with whatever forces he could muster. What happened next belongs partly to history and partly to legend, and the line between the two is, as it so often is in accounts of founding moments, difficult to draw with any certainty. The Inca forces, despite being apparently outnumbered and fighting without the support of their nominal ruler, managed to defeat the Chunka army in a battle or series of battles around Cusco. The legendary dimension of this victory involves the Pururocas, the stones that turned into warriors. According to the tradition, at the moment when the battle seemed most desperate, when the Chunka appeared on the verge of overwhelming the Inca defenders, the very stones of the field rose up and transformed into soldiers who fought alongside Qhapaq and his men. This miracle, attributed by some versions to the intervention of the sun god Inti himself, turned the tide of battle and ensured the Inca victory. Whether we understand this legend as a metaphor for unexpected reinforcements arriving from allied communities, or as a reflection of the supernatural legitimacy that the later Inca state wished to attach to its founding moment, or simply as a story that grew in the telling, as such stories do, the core historical reality appears to be that Qhapaq achieved a victory that his own father had thought impossible, and in doing so fundamentally altered his position within Inca society. The aftermath of the Chunka defeat saw Qhapaq ascend to the position of Super Inca, though the precise circumstances of this transition, including the fate of his father, Viracocha Inca, and his designated heir Inca Urcon, are recorded somewhat differently in different sources. What is clear is that the young man who had saved Cusco took upon himself a new name, Pachacuti, signaling his intention not merely to rule but to transform. The word Pachacuti in Quechua carries connotations of a great turning or reversal, a cosmic reordering, the kind of fundamental change that reshapes the world itself. And this is what the new ruler set about accomplishing through decades of military conquest, administrative innovation, and religious reform. The military expansion under Pachacuti represents one of the most remarkable campaigns of territorial acquisition in pre-modern history, accomplished without wheeled vehicles, without horses, and without iron weapons. using the resources and logistical capabilities of an Andean highland society. To the south, Inca armies under Pachacuti's direction, and increasingly under the command of his capable son and eventual successor, Qhapaq Inca Yupanqui, pushed the boundaries of imperial control toward the Great Lake known as Titicaca, incorporating the Colla and Lupaca peoples who inhabited the Altiplano region. This expansion brought the Inca into contact with the ruins and legends of Tiwanaku, an earlier Andean civilization whose monumental architecture and sophisticated stonework had already been abandoned for centuries, and whose memory would influence Inca ideas about their own origins and the sacred geography of the southern highlands. To the north, the expansion was equally dramatic, extending Inca control through the highlands of what is now Peru and into the territories of what is now Ecuador. The conquest of the Chimu Kingdom on the northern coast, though this final achievement is sometimes attributed primarily to Qhapaq Inca Yupanqui, had its foundations laid during Pachacuti's reign, as the systematic incorporation of highland polities created the base from which coastal conquest became possible. By the end of Pachacuti's rule, and continuing under his son, the Inca domain stretched along the western spine of South America for thousands of kilometers, incorporating peoples who spoke different languages, practiced different customs, and inhabited environments ranging from coastal deserts to tropical forests to high-altitude grasslands. This vast territorial expansion, impressive as it was in purely military terms, would have meant relatively little without the administrative genius that Pachacuti brought to the task of actually governing these diverse territories. And it is in his organizational innovations that we perhaps see his most lasting contributions to Andean civilization. The Mitas system, while drawing on earlier Andean traditions of reciprocal labor obligation, was systematized and extended under Pachacuti's rule to create a mechanism by which the state could mobilize the labor of its subjects on a scale sufficient to build roads, construct monumental architecture, work agricultural lands, serve in armies, and produce the textiles and other goods that the imperial economy required. Under this system, households owed a certain amount of labor time to the state, rotated among different tasks according to state needs, and in return received access to state resources and the protection that membership in the empire theoretically provided. The administrative division of the empire into 4 quarters, the Tawantinsuyu, or land of the 4 parts together, though it built upon pre-existing concepts of Andean spatial organization, was refined and formalized during Pachacuti's reign. These 4 shus, named Chinchai-Suyu in the northwest, Antisuyu in the northeast, Kolasuyu in the southeast, and Kuntisuyu in the southwest, provided a framework for organizing the empire's provincial administration, its census records, its tribute obligations, and its understanding of the world's fundamental geography. Cusco itself sat at the center of this 4-fold division, the navel of the world from which the 4 quarters extended outward to the edges of the known and civilized world. The road system that would eventually span the entire empire, connecting communities separated by hundreds of kilometers of difficult mountain terrain, received significant development during Pachacuti's reign. These roads, paved in some sections and carefully maintained throughout, included suspension bridges crossing deep river gorges, stairways ascending steep mountain slopes, and tambos or way stations placed at regular intervals where travelers on state business could find shelter and supplies. The roads served multiple purposes, facilitating the rapid movement of armies when military action was required, enabling the relay runners called chasquis to carry messages and small goods across vast distances with remarkable speed, and allowing the administrators and inspectors of the imperial bureaucracy to travel throughout the realm. The physical transformation of Cusco itself during Pachacuti's reign reflects both his practical administrative concerns and his sense of the symbolic importance of the capital as the sacred center of the Inca world. According to tradition, Pachacuti ordered the city rebuilt according to a new plan, one that gave the urban layout the shape of a puma when viewed from above, with the great fortress of Sacsayhuamán forming the head of this symbolic animal. The cyclopean stonework of Sacsayhuamán, with its precisely fitted blocks weighing many tons each, represents one of the most impressive architectural achievements of pre-Columbian America. And while construction likely continued beyond Pachacuti's lifetime, the project was initiated during his reign as part of his comprehensive reimagining of the capital. Among the construction projects attributed to Pachacuti's reign, perhaps none has captured the modern imagination so completely as the royal estate that we know today as Machu Picchu. Built around 1450 of the Common Era on a dramatic ridge between two peaks, overlooking the Vilcabamba River far below. This complex of temples, residences, agricultural terraces, and ceremonial spaces appears to have served as a retreat for the royal household, a place where the Sapa Inca and his court could escape the altitude and climate of Cusco for a somewhat warmer and more secluded environment. The site's spectacular setting, its sophisticated water management systems, its precisely constructed stonework, and its integration with the surrounding landscape all reflect the technical and aesthetic capabilities of Inca architecture at its height under Pachacuti's patronage. The religious dimensions of Pachacuti's reign deserve attention as well, for his transformation of the Inca state extended to matters of theology and ritual. While the sun god, Inti, remains central to Inca religious practice and to the legitimacy of the Safa Inca as the son of the sun, Pachacuti appears to have elevated the importance of the creator deity Viracocha, also known by other names and epithets, within the Inca religious system. This creator god, who in Inca cosmology had made the world, the sun, the moon, and humanity itself, represented a more abstract and universal divine principle than the sun cult, and his prominence in Pachacuti's religious reforms may reflect the practical challenges of ruling an empire of many peoples with many local gods, for whom a universal creator deity might provide a more inclusive framework for religious unity. The man who came to be known as Pachacuti passed from this life around 1471 of the Common Era, leaving behind an empire transformed almost beyond recognition from the modest kingdom he had defended against the Chunka some 3 decades earlier. His son and successor, Qhapaq Inca Yupanqui, would continue the work of expansion and consolidation, and his grandson, Huayna Qhapaq, would rule over the empire at its greatest extent. But the fundamental structures of Tawantinsuyu, its administrative systems, its road networks, its imperial ideology, bore the stamp of Pachacuti's transformative vision in the gentle accounting of history, where cause and effect unfold across generations, and the work of building is always more complex than any single narrative can capture. Pachacuti stands as the architect of what the Inca Empire became, the earthshaker who took a moment of crisis and turned it into the foundation of something that would endure, if not forever, then long enough to leave its mark upon the mountains and the peoples who called them home. Let us now turn our attention to one of the most remarkable systems of record-keeping ever devised by human beings. A method of storing and transmitting information that required no paper, no ink, no written alphabet of any kind, and yet proved capable of administering an empire that stretched across thousands of kilometers and encompassed millions of people. This was the Quipu, a device constructed entirely from cords and knots, and in its elegant simplicity, we find a testament to the inventiveness of the Inca mind, a demonstration that writing as we commonly understand it represents only one of many possible solutions to the challenge of preserving knowledge across time and distance. The physical construction of a quipu followed a consistent pattern, though individual examples varied considerably in size and complexity, depending upon the nature of the information they were designed to contain. At the foundation of every quipu lay what modern scholars call the primary cord, a length of spun fiber that might extend anywhere from a few centimeters to well over a meter in length, serving as the structural spine from which all other elements would hang. Attached to this primary cord at regular intervals were the pendant cords, hanging downward like the teeth of a comb or the fringe of a textile, and it was upon these pendant cords that the actual information of the quipu was recorded through the careful placement and tying of knots. Some quipus contained only a handful of pendant cords, while others incorporated hundreds or even thousands, and the largest surviving example includes approximately 1,500 pendant strings, creating a dense cascade of knotted fibers that must have required considerable expertise to both construct and interpret. The materials used in quipu construction reflected the resources available in the Andean environment and the importance accorded to these recording devices. Cotton proved to be a common choice, particularly in coastal regions where this plant flourished and where the climate was warm enough to support its cultivation, and the resulting cords possessed a smooth texture that accepted dyes readily and allowed for clear differentiation between colors. In highland areas, the fibers of camelids provided the raw material, with llama and alpaca wool being twisted into serviceable cords, while the finest quipus sometimes incorporated the extraordinarily soft fleece of the vicuña, an animal whose wool was so precious that its hunting was restricted to royal privilege during Inca times. The spinning and plying of these fibers required considerable skill, as the resulting cords needed to be strong enough to withstand regular handling while remaining flexible enough to accept the various knot formations that would encode the desired information. Color played an essential role in the quipu system, functioning as a categorical marker that indicated what type of information a particular pendant cord contained. A quipu recording the census of a province might use one color to represent men, another to represent women, and still others to represent various age categories or occupational groups, so that the reader of the quipu could immediately understand not just the numerical values encoded in the knots, but also what those numbers referred to. Natural dye sources from plants, minerals, and insects provided the Inca craftspeople with a palette of colors that included reds derived from cochineal, yellows from various plant sources, blues achieved through indigo, and numerous intermediate shades created through mixing and overdyeing. Some surviving quipus display remarkable chromatic sophistication, with pendant cords featuring two or more colors twisted together, or with individual cords that change color partway along their length, suggesting that the Inca system of color coding was capable of expressing subtle distinctions and combinations of meaning. The numerical information recorded on quipus relied upon a decimal counting system, which is to say, a system based on multiples of 10. the same mathematical foundation that underlies our own modern numbering conventions. The position of a knot along the length of a pendant cord indicated its place value within this decimal framework, with knots placed nearest to the bottom of the cord representing single units, knots placed above these representing tens, and still higher positions representing hundreds, thousands, and potentially even larger values. The number of knots tied at each position indicated the specific digit being recorded, so that 4 knots in the tens position, followed by 7 knots in the units position, would represent the number 47. And this straightforward positional system allowed Quipu keepers to record numbers of considerable magnitude with precision and clarity. Different types of knots serve different purposes within the Quipu system, adding another layer of meaningful variation to the arrangement of fibers. The most common knot types included the simple overhand knot, the figure-8 knot, and a more elaborate long knot that incorporated multiple turns around the cord and proved particularly useful for indicating the unit position in a number. The absence of knots in a particular position functioned as the equivalent of a 0, indicating that no value needed to be recorded at that place in the decimal sequence. And this understanding of 0 as a placeholder demonstrates the mathematical sophistication of Inca numeracy. When a pendant cord recorded no value at all, it might be left entirely without knots, or it might be marked in some other way to indicate that a null value had been deliberately recorded rather than simply overlooked. The men who created, maintained, and interpreted Quipus held a position of considerable importance within Inca society, bearing the title of Quipus Amayoc, which translates roughly to keeper of the quipus or master of the knots. These were not casual craftspeople or part-time officials, but rather highly trained specialists who devoted their professional lives to the accurate recording and transmission of information essential to the functioning of the state. The training of a Quipu Kamayoks began in childhood and continued over many years, involving not only the technical skills of cord construction and knot tying, but also memorization of the coding conventions that gave meaning to the physical arrangements of the Quipu, because the Quipu itself did not contain an explicit key to its own interpretation. The Quipu Kamayok had to carry within his memory the contextual knowledge necessary to decode the information preserved in any particular example, remembering what each color signified, what category of information each pendant cord position represented, and how the various elements combined to create a coherent record. The responsibility borne by the Quipu Kamayoks was commensurate with the importance of their work, and the consequences for error were severe indeed. Spanish chroniclers who observed the Inca system during its final functioning years recorded that a Quipu Kamayoks who made mistakes in recording or reporting information could face execution, a penalty that reflects both the critical nature of accurate record-keeping for state administration and the high value placed upon truthfulness in Inca culture. The Quipu Kamayok was expected to verify his records against those kept by other officials in different locations, creating a system of cross-referencing that helped to ensure accuracy and detect any inconsistencies that might indicate error or falsification. When Spanish colonial administrators sought to understand the tribute obligations and population distributions of newly conquered territories, they often relied upon the testimony of Quipu Kamayoks, who would read from their quipus and provide detailed accounts of resources, populations, and historical events. The question of what precisely quipus were capable of recording has occupied scholars for many decades and remains a subject of ongoing investigation and debate. The numerical function is well established and beyond dispute, with clear evidence that quipus served as accounting devices for tracking tribute payments, census figures, inventories of goods in state storehouses, and calculations related to agricultural production and distribution. Spanish colonial documents confirm that quipus recorded detailed demographic information, listing populations by province, by community, and by various categorical subdivisions, and that this information proved sufficiently reliable for the Spanish to use it as a basis for their own administrative purposes. But the testimony of the Spanish chroniclers also suggests that quipus recorded much more than numbers alone, with accounts describing quipus that preserved laws, histories, religious ceremonies, songs, and narratives of various kinds, information that would seem to require something more like a true writing system than a simple accounting device. Modern research into this question has been advanced significantly by the work of scholars such as Gary Urton, whose investigations suggest that quipus may indeed encode a level of narrative information that has not yet been fully deciphered. Urton has proposed that the direction of spin in the constituent fibers, the direction in which knots are tied, the specific attachment methods used to connect pendant cords to the primary cord, and various other structural features may carry meaningful information beyond the obvious numerical content, potentially creating a kind of binary coding system with enough complexity to encode words and ideas rather than merely quantities. If this interpretation proves correct, then the quipu would represent not simply a counting device, but a genuine system of writing, albeit one operating on principles quite different from the alphabetic or logographic scripts developed in other parts of the world. The full decipherment of quipu narrative content, if such content exists, remains a goal for future research, and the fragments of understanding achieved thus far offer tantalizing glimpses of an information system that may prove far more sophisticated than earlier scholars imagined. The survival of quipus to the present day represents something of a small miracle, given the deliberate efforts that were made to destroy them during the colonial period. In the year 1583, the Third Council of Lima, an ecclesiastical gathering convened to address matters of religious practice and doctrine in the Spanish colonial territory, issued an order calling for the destruction of quipus on the grounds that they were idolatrous objects connected to the indigenous religious practices that the Catholic Church sought to eradicate. This decree resulted in the burning and disposal of countless quipus, eliminating records that might otherwise have preserved detailed information about Inca history, administration, and thought. The loss represented by this destruction cannot be adequately measured, though we may assume that the great majority of quipus in existence at the time of the conquest have been lost forever, taking with them whatever knowledge they contained. Despite this systematic destruction, approximately 600 quipus have survived into the present day, preserved in museums and collections around the world, where they serve as primary sources for ongoing scholarly investigation. Some of these surviving examples were hidden away by indigenous communities, who maintain their traditional practices despite Spanish prohibitions, while others found their way into the hands of colonial officials or collectors, who recognized their curiosity value, even if they could not fully understand their function. The physical condition of surviving quipus varies considerably, with some retaining their full complement of pendant cords in good condition, while others have deteriorated significantly, with missing or damaged sections that complicate efforts at interpretation. One of the most significant discoveries of recent decades occurred in 1996 at a site known as Laguna de los Condores in northern Peru. where a group of farmers stumbled upon a series of funerary structures perched on a cliff face above a remote mountain lake. Within these structures, archaeologists discovered the remarkably well-preserved remains of Sacsayhuamán burials, along with a wealth of associated grave goods. And among these objects were 32 intact quipus, representing the largest single cache of these recording devices ever found in an archaeological context. The dry conditions within the cliff tombs had protected these quipus from the humidity that causes organic fibers to decay, and as a result, they have provided researchers with exceptional examples for analysis. Their colors still vivid, their knots still clearly defined, their pendant cords complete and countable. The Laguna de los Condores quipus have contributed substantially to our understanding of regional variations in Quipu construction, and may yet yield additional insights as analysis continues. Perhaps most remarkable of all is the fact that quipus have not entirely disappeared from use in certain Andean communities, where they continue to play a role in local governance and ceremonial life even today. In the village of San Andrés de Chupicocha, located in the central highlands of Peru, community authorities still maintain quipus that are brought out and displayed during annual assemblies, functioning as symbols of traditional authority and as objects of cultural continuity, linking present generations to their ancestors. These modern quipus may not serve the complex administrative functions of their Inca-era predecessors, but their continued ceremonial presence demonstrates the enduring significance of this recording technology in Andean cultural memory and identity. And so we come to rest with the image of knotted cords, simple materials transformed through human ingenuity into instruments of memory and administration, their meanings partially obscured by the passage of centuries, but not entirely lost. The Quipu Qhapaq, who created and interpreted these records, are long departed, but their handiwork remains, patient and quiet, awaiting whatever further understanding future scholars may bring to its tangled threads, while in mountain villages, the tradition persists in attenuated form, a slender connection to a system of knowledge that once helped govern an empire of the sun. And now we shall turn our attention to something quite remarkable, though we shall consider it in the most restful manner possible, which is the great road network of the Inca Empire, a system of paths and bridges and way stations that stretched across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, connecting distant provinces and remote villages to the imperial center at Cusco, and doing so with an elegance of design and a thoroughness of execution that still inspires a quiet sort of admiration in those who study such things today. The Inca called this network the Qhapaq, which translates rather pleasingly as the Royal Road, or perhaps more literally as the principal path. Though in truth, it was not a single road at all, but rather an interconnected system of routes that wove through coastal deserts and climbed into frozen mountain passes and descended into humid river valleys, all of it maintained and patrolled and constantly in use, carrying administrators and soldiers and messengers and tribute goods from one end of the empire to the other, a distance that one can scarcely imagine without the aid of modern maps and a comfortable chair in which to study them. The total length of this road system, when all its branches and tributaries are measured and added together, comes to approximately 25,000 miles, which is a figure that tends to make people pause and consider what such a distance really means, for it is roughly equivalent to the circumference of the Earth itself, and all of it was constructed without wheeled vehicles or iron tools or draft animals capable of pulling heavy loads, using instead the patient labor of countless workers who shaped stone with stone and moved earth with wooden implements, and created something that would endure for centuries beyond the empire that built it. This network of roads stretched across what are now 6 modern countries, threading through the territories we know today as Colombia and Ecuador and Peru and Bolivia and Chile and Argentina. Though of course the people who built and used these roads knew nothing of such divisions, understanding their world instead as Tawantinsuyu, the land of the 4 quarters, all of it connected by these carefully maintained paths that made the administration of such a vast territory not merely possible, but remarkably efficient in ways that continue to interest scholars who study the mechanics of pre-industrial states. The system was organized around 2 great north-south arteries, the primary routes that served as the spine of the entire network, with numerous lateral connections branching off to link these main roads to each other and to the various provinces and settlements that lay between them and beyond them. The first of these main routes ran along the coast, following the narrow strip of habitable land between the Pacific Ocean and the western slopes of the Andes, passing through the desert regions where rain almost never falls, and where the road builders had to consider not snow or mud, but rather the shifting sands and the occasional river valleys that cut across the otherwise barren landscape, requiring bridges and careful routing to ensure that travelers could find water and shelter at appropriate intervals. The second main route, and in many ways the more impressive of the 2, ran through the highlands themselves, climbing through the mountain valleys and crossing passes at elevations that would leave most people quite breathless and uncomfortable, threading between snow-capped peaks and skirting the edges of deep gorges, maintaining a remarkably consistent quality of construction despite the extraordinary challenges presented by such terrain, challenges that would give pause to modern engineers with all their machinery and expertise. The engineering achievements represented by these highland roads were really quite extraordinary, though we shall consider them in a calm and measured fashion, noting without undue emphasis the various solutions that Inca engineers developed to overcome the obstacles placed in their path by the mountainous landscape through which they were determined to build. In many places, the roads were paved with carefully fitted stones, creating surfaces that remained stable and passable even during the rainy season, when unpaved paths would have become impassable rivers of mud. And these paved sections could be quite broad, reaching widths of up to 24 feet in the most important stretches, allowing for the passage of large groups of travelers or the movement of military forces with all their accompanying supplies and equipment. Where the roads climbed steep mountainsides, the builders carved staircases directly into the living rock of the cliff faces, creating steps that wound upward in careful zigzags, reducing the angle of ascent to something manageable for humans and their burden-carrying llamas. And these staircases still exist in many places, worn smooth by centuries of use, but still functional, still connecting villages to mountain pastures, just as they did when the Supper Inca ruled from Cusco. Perhaps the most visually striking elements of the road system were the bridges, for the deep gorges and rushing rivers of the Andes presented obstacles that could not be avoided or easily circumvented. And the Inca solution to this problem was the rope suspension bridge, a technology that they developed to a remarkable degree of sophistication and deployed throughout their mountain territories. These bridges were constructed from ropes woven from the fibers of local grasses, particularly a variety called ichu that grows abundantly in the high grasslands of the Andes. And these fibers were twisted into thick cables that could support considerable weight, cables as thick as a person's body, in some cases, anchored to stone abutments on either side of the gorge and forming the basis for a walkway suspended high above the churning waters below. Some of these rope bridges span distances of 150 feet or more, swaying gently in the mountain winds as travelers cross them. And while such an experience might seem rather alarming to consider, the bridges were in fact carefully engineered and regularly maintained, rebuilt entirely on an annual basis to ensure that the plant fibers never had a chance to weaken beyond the point of safety. The practice of rebuilding these bridges was itself a carefully organized affair, with specific communities assigned responsibility for specific bridges. The work carried out as a form of miti labor, the rotational service that all subjects of the empire owed to the state, and the rebuilding was accomplished in a matter of days through the coordinated efforts of many hands working together according to traditions passed down through generations. One of these bridges, known as Qhapaq, still exists today and is still rebuilt each year using the same traditional methods that were employed during Inca times, a living connection to the engineering practices of 5 centuries ago, maintained by 4 local communities who gather each June to replace the old bridge with a new one, weaving the grass ropes and suspending them across the gorge just as their ancestors did. A quiet continuation of ancient knowledge in the modern world. The roads themselves would have been of limited use without the support infrastructure that made long-distance travel practical, and the most important element of this infrastructure was the system of tambos, or way stations, that were positioned at regular intervals along all the major routes. These tambos were spaced approximately 12 to 18 miles apart, which is to say at intervals representing roughly a day's travel on foot through mountainous terrain, and they provided travelers with shelter and food and a place to rest before continuing their journey the following morning, ensuring that no one using the royal roads need sleep exposed to the elements or go hungry along the way. The tambos varied in size and complexity depending on their location and importance, with some being relatively simple shelters and others being substantial complexes with storerooms and lodgings for officials of various ranks. And the largest tambos functioned almost as small towns, with resident staff to maintain the facilities and prepare food for important visitors and keep accurate records of who passed through and what goods they carried. The storerooms of the tambos were kept stocked through the tribute system, filled with dried foods and textiles and sandals and whatever else a traveler might need. All of it carefully inventoried and tracked using the Quipu recording system, so that officials in Cusco could know what supplies were available at any given point along the road network, and plan accordingly for military campaigns or administrative journeys, or the movement of labor forces to construction projects. One of the most remarkable uses of this road system was the chasqui relay runner system, a method of rapid communication that allowed messages and small goods to travel across the empire at speeds that seem almost impossible given the terrain involved and the absence of horses or any other riding animals. The chasqui were specially trained runners stationed at small posts along the roads, each responsible for a stretch of perhaps a mile or two, and when a message needed to be sent, it would be passed from one runner to the next in an unbroken relay, each chasqui sprinting his portion at full speed before handing off to the next runner, who was already prepared and waiting. Through this system, messages could travel 150 miles or more in a single day, crossing mountain passes and descending into valleys and climbing again, moving far faster than any individual could travel. And the system was used not only for administrative communications, but also for the transport of small luxury goods that required speed rather than bulk. The most famous example of this was the delivery of fresh fish from the Pacific coast to the royal court at Cusco, a distance of several hundred miles through some of the highest terrain on Earth. yet the fish would arrive still fresh enough to be enjoyed by the Sapa Inca, a luxury made possible only by the extraordinary efficiency of the chasqui system and the roads upon which it depended. The primary burden carriers on these roads were not humans, but llamas, those gentle and patient animals that the Andean peoples had domesticated thousands of years before the rise of the Inca, and llamas served as the transport animals of the empire, carrying goods along the roads in great caravans that might number in the hundreds or even thousands of animals. A healthy llama could carry approximately 75 pounds of cargo, which is not an enormous amount by the standards of donkeys or horses, but llamas were well adapted to the high-altitude environment in which they were required to work, able to thrive on the sparse vegetation of the mountain pastures and endure the cold nights without difficulty, making them invaluable despite their relatively modest carrying capacity. One peculiarity of llamas that shaped how they were used is that they absolutely refused to be ridden, and any attempt to mount a llama would result in the animal simply lying down and refusing to move, or perhaps spitting at the would-be rider with considerable accuracy and evident displeasure. And so the Inca Empire functioned without riding animals of any kind, with everyone from the common laborer to the Sapa Inca himself traveling on foot, or in the case of the emperor, being carried in a litter borne by human porters. Along the highest reaches of the mountain roads, travelers would encounter the apachetas, which were cairns of stones marking the passes and the difficult stretches. And these cairns had both practical and spiritual significance, serving as navigation aids in places where the path might be obscured by snow or fog, and also serving as places of offering where travelers would add a stone to the pile and perhaps leave a small gift to the mountain spirits, asking for safe passage through the dangerous heights. The tradition of adding stones to the apachetas continues to this day among Andean peoples, and the cairns have grown quite large over the centuries, visible from considerable distances, marking the places where the road crosses from one drainage to another, from one world to the next, in the understanding of those who built and maintain them. In the year 2014, the Qhapaq Nyan was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognition of its outstanding universal value as one of the great engineering achievements of human history, a network of roads that bound together an empire and facilitated the movement of people and goods and ideas across a landscape that would seem to forbid such connection. And this designation helps to ensure that the remaining portions of the road system will be preserved and studied and appreciated by future generations. Much of the original road network has been lost to time and development, covered by modern highways or eroded by centuries of weather or dismantled for building materials, but significant stretches remain, particularly in the more remote mountain areas where there has been less pressure for development. And these surviving sections give us a sense of what the complete system must have been like, the ambition and the craftsmanship and the sheer scale of the undertaking. Walking on these ancient roads today, one can still see the careful fitting of the paving stones and the precise alignment of the staircases and the remains of the drainage channels that kept the road surface from being damaged by runoff. Evidence of the planning and maintenance that went into keeping the system functional, the administrative attention that made the whole enterprise possible. And so as we think of these 25,000 miles of mountain highways, these paths carved into cliff faces, and these bridges swung across impossible gorges, and these way stations offering shelter and sustenance to weary travelers, we might allow ourselves to appreciate, in a quiet and restful way, the extraordinary achievement that the Qhapaq Nyan represents, a monument to human ingenuity and organization that remains impressive even now. 5 centuries after the empire that built it ceased to exist. And we can let this appreciation settle gently into our thoughts as we continue to rest and breathe slowly. The ancient roads stretching across the mountains of our imagination, connecting distant places in the soft darkness of a peaceful mind. High above the Vilcabamba river, where the morning clouds drift through steep valleys like slow rivers of white cotton, there sits a place that has captured the imagination of people around the world. Though for many centuries it remained known only to the families who farmed its quiet terraces and the condors who circled its ancient stones. This place is Machu Picchu, and its story is one of remarkable engineering, peaceful purpose, and a kind of gentle forgetting that allowed it to sleep undisturbed, while empires rose and fell in the valleys far below. The name itself comes from the Quechua language and means simply Old Peak, a straightforward description that belies the extraordinary complexity of what the Inca builders created here, perched on a narrow ridge between 2 mountains, surrounded on 3 sides by the winding river, nearly 2,000 feet below. The construction of Machu Picchu began around the year 1450 of the Common Era, during the reign of the great Inca ruler Pachacuti, whose name means "he who shakes the earth," though the shaking he accomplished here was of a gentler sort, the patient movement of stone and soil to create something lasting and beautiful. Pachacuti chose this particular ridge for reasons that combine the practical with the spiritual, for the Inca understanding of the world made little distinction between these 2 ways of knowing. The site sits at an elevation of approximately 7,970 feet above sea level, which places it above the humid lowland valleys, but below the harsh cold of the highest peaks, in a zone where the climate remains relatively mild throughout the year, and where clouds often gather in the mornings before burning away to reveal spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. The location also held deep significance in terms of Inca cosmology, aligned as it was with various celestial events, and surrounded by peaks that the Inca considered sacred beings worthy of veneration and respect. The builders who came to this ridge faced challenges that might have discouraged less determined peoples, for the terrain offered no flat ground to speak of, only steep slopes of granite and thin soil that seemed to resist any attempt at permanent settlement. Yet the Inca engineers, drawing on generations of accumulated knowledge about working with difficult landscapes, developed techniques that transformed this unpromising ridge into a functioning community capable of supporting hundreds of people in considerable comfort. They began by studying the natural contours of the land, identifying the stable bedrock beneath the surface and mapping the flow of water during the rainy season. Rather than fighting against the mountain's essential nature, they worked with it, carving terraces into the slopes and fitting their buildings into the spaces that the rock itself seemed to offer. The stones they used came largely from the mountain itself, granite blocks that they shaped with bronze tools and patience, fitting them together so precisely that even today, more than 5 centuries later, a knife blade cannot be inserted between many of the joints. At its peak of occupation, Machu Picchu housed approximately 750 people, a modest number that reflects the site's true purpose, which was never to serve as a great city or military stronghold, but rather as a royal retreat, a place where the Inca ruler and his court could escape the demands of the capital at Cusco and find renewal in the mountain air. The permanent population consisted largely of servants and retainers who maintained the estate year-round, tending the agricultural terraces, keeping the fountains flowing, and preparing for the periodic visits of the royal household. When the Inca came, accompanied by nobles and priests and the various officials necessary for even a working vacation. The population would swell, and the quiet estate would take on a more festive character, with ceremonies conducted at the sacred stones and feasts prepared in the many-roomed complexes that dotted the ridge. But even then, the atmosphere would have been one of peaceful contemplation rather than urban bustle, for this was a place designed for rest and spiritual reflection. Among the most remarkable features of Machu Picchu is a carved stone known as the Intihuatana, a name that translates poetically as the hitching post of the sun. This carefully shaped granite pillar rises from a platform of worked stone, its angles cut to align with specific astronomical events throughout the year. The Inca priests who used this stone were skilled observers of the heavens, and they employed the Intihuatana to track the movement of the sun across the sky, marking the solstices and equinoxes with ceremonies that reaffirm the connection between the Inca ruler, who was considered a child of the sun, and the celestial body that gave life to all things. At noon on the equinoxes, when day and night are of equal length across the world, the sun stands almost directly above the pillar and casts virtually no shadow, an effect that the Inca astronomers observed with great attention. The name hitching post suggests that the stone serves symbolically to tie the sun to the earth, preventing it from flying away during the winter months when its warmth seemed to diminish, though of course the actual use involved careful observation rather than magical intervention. The water management system at Machu Picchu represents one of the finest achievements of Inca engineering, a sophisticated network of channels, fountains, and drains that provided fresh water to every part of the estate, while preventing the erosion that might otherwise have washed the entire settlement down into the valley below. The primary water source is a spring located nearly a mile away from the main settlement, on the steep slopes of the mountain called Machu Picchu. And from this spring, the Inca engineers built a canal that carries water along a carefully graded channel to the edge of the urban area. The gradient of this canal was calculated with remarkable precision, steep enough to maintain a steady flow, but gentle enough to prevent the rushing water from eroding its stone-lined bed. Once the water reached the settlement, it flowed through a series of 16 fountains arranged in a descending chain, each one slightly lower than the last, so that the water cascaded from basin to basin in a gentle murmur that would have provided a pleasant background sound to daily life. The first and highest fountain was positioned near the residence of the Inca himself, ensuring that the ruler received the freshest water before it passed to the lower levels, a practical arrangement that also reinforced social hierarchies in a typically Inca fashion. The agricultural terraces that surround Machu Picchu are themselves marvels of engineering, designed not merely to create flat planting surfaces on steep slopes, but to manage water drainage, prevent erosion, and maintain the fertility of the soil over many growing seasons. The construction of each terrace began with the building of a stone retaining wall, fitted together with the same precision as the walls of the finest buildings. Then behind this wall, the builders laid a drainage layer of large stones that allowed excess water to pass through without washing away the soil above. Above the drainage stones came a layer of gravel, then a layer of sand, and finally a deep layer of topsoil, often brought from the valley floor far below, rich in the nutrients necessary for growing crops. This layering system meant that heavy rains, which come frequently during the wet season, would pass through the soil and into the drainage layer, rather than pooling on the surface or rushing across the terraces in destructive torrents. The terraces also created microclimates, with the stone walls absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night, protecting delicate crops from frost and extending the growing season. The built environment of Machu Picchu comprises approximately 140 structures of various sizes and purposes, ranging from simple storage buildings to elaborate temples, where the most sacred ceremonies were conducted. Among the most impressive of these buildings is the Temple of the Sun, a curved structure built upon a natural rock outcropping, its walls following the contour of the boulder beneath in a way that speaks to the Inca reverence for natural forms. The stonework of this temple is among the finest at the site, with blocks fitted so precisely and polished so smoothly that they seem almost to flow together like water frozen in mid-movement. A window in the temple wall aligns with the position of the rising sun during the winter solstice, allowing a shaft of light to enter and illuminate a specific point on the central rock, a dramatic effect that would have held deep meaning for the priests and nobles gathered to witness it. Nearby stands another significant structure known as the Room of the Three Windows, a building whose east-facing wall contains three large trapezoidal windows that look out over the valley below and frame the mountains beyond in a way that suggests intentional aesthetic consideration as much as practical function. For many centuries, Machu Picchu remained unknown to the wider world, escaping the attention of the Spanish conquistadors who arrived in Peru in 1532 and proceeded to dismantle much of Inca civilization in their search for gold and their zeal to convert the indigenous population to Christianity. The reasons for this fortunate obscurity are not entirely clear, though several factors likely contributed, including the site's remote location, its relatively modest size compared to the great cities the Spanish were most interested in plundering, and perhaps a deliberate decision by the local population to keep quiet about its existence. Whatever the reasons, the Spanish never found Machu Picchu, and so its temples were never demolished, its stones never carried off for use in colonial churches, its sacred objects never melted down for their precious metals. The site was gradually abandoned as the old Inca order collapsed, and the forest slowly reclaimed its terraces and plazas, though local families continued to know of its existence and even to farm some of its lower terraces, maintaining a quiet continuity with the past. The man usually credited with bringing Machu Picchu to international attention was an American historian and explorer named Hiram Bingham, who arrived at the site on July 24, 1911, though to call this a discovery in the fullest sense would be misleading. Bingham was searching for Vilcabamba, the legendary lost city where the last Inca rulers had resisted Spanish conquest, and his journey brought him to the Urubamba Valley, where he inquired among the local population about ancient ruins in the area. A farmer named Melchor Arteaga told Bingham of significant ruins high on the ridge above, and for a small payment agreed to guide the explorer to the site. The climb was steep and difficult, conducted in drizzling rain, and when Bingham finally reached the ridge, exhausted and uncertain of what he would find, he was met by a young boy named Pablito Alvarez, who was approximately 11 years old and whose family was among those living and farming among the ancient stones. It was Pablito who guided Bingham through the overgrown ruins, showing him the temples and terraces that would soon become famous around the world. What Bingham found was not an empty ruin waiting to be discovered, but rather a living landscape where three families had made their homes among the ancient structures, farming the terraces much as their ancestors had done, and maintaining a practical relationship with the site that had nothing to do with archaeological curiosity or romantic notions of lost civilizations. These families, whose names deserve to be remembered, alongside Bingham's own, had kept Machu Picchu alive in a quiet way, and their presence complicates the simple narrative of discovery that would later be attached to Bingham's expedition. Nevertheless, Bingham's reports and photographs brought Machu Picchu to the attention of scholars and the public worldwide, and subsequent expeditions cleared the vegetation, mapped the structures, and began the long process of studying this remarkable place. The expeditions led by Bingham removed approximately 40,000 artifacts from Machu Picchu, taking them to Yale University in the United States for study, and this removal would become the source of controversy that persisted for nearly a century. The Peruvian government maintained that the artifacts had been loaned rather than given, while Yale argued that they had been legitimately acquired and were being properly cared for and studied. The dispute continued through decades of negotiations, legal proceedings, and diplomatic discussions, with Peru asserting its right to its cultural heritage and Yale defending its possession of the collection. Finally, in 2012, the last of the artifacts were returned to Peru, where they now reside in a museum near Cusco, available for Peruvians and visitors to see in the land of their origin. A resolution that brought closure to a complicated chapter in the history of archaeological practice and cultural patrimony. Today, Machu Picchu receives hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, people who come from every corner of the world to walk its ancient paths and wonder at the skill and vision of those who built it, and efforts continue to protect and preserve this place for future generations, allowing it to remain what it has been for so many centuries, a quiet sanctuary above the clouds, where the stones still hold the memory of the children of the sun. And so we come now to a period of great difficulty for the Inca realm, a time of internal struggle that would leave the empire weakened and divided. Though, of course, no one living through those years could have known what was still to come. This was the war between two brothers, both sons of the great Qhapaq, both claiming the right to wear the royal fringe and sit upon the throne in Cusco. Their names were Huáscar and Atahualpa, and their conflict would reshape the Andes in ways that echo still through the centuries, though we shall speak of it gently here, as one recounts a difficult chapter from a very old book, knowing that understanding the past helps us to rest more easily in the present. To understand how this war began, we must first return to the reign of Qhapaq himself, who ruled the empire at the height of its territorial extent, stretching from the hot lowlands of what is now Colombia all the way south to the cool valleys of Chile. Qhapaq was a powerful ruler, and like the Sapa Incas before him, he had many wives and many children, as was the custom among Andean royalty. Among his sons were Huáscar, whose mother was the Coya, the principal queen, making him in many eyes the most legitimate heir to the throne according to traditional succession practices. And there was also Atahualpa, whose mother was a woman from the northern regions, possibly from the recently conquered territories around Quito, though the precise details of his parentage remain a matter of historical discussion even now. Qhapaq spent much of his later reign in the northern provinces, overseeing the administration of recently added territories and conducting military campaigns along the empire's northern frontiers. He built palaces at Vilcabamba and Quito, and Atahualpa grew up in this northern world, surrounded by experienced generals and battle-hardened armies, becoming familiar with military command from an early age. Huáscar, meanwhile, remained closer to Cusco, the ancient capital, the navel of the world, as the Incas called it, where the mummified ancestors were housed and the great festivals were held. These two brothers, then, grew into men in very different worlds, one in the traditional heartland and one on the expanding frontier. And this geographical separation would prove significant when the time came for succession. Sometime around the year 1527, though precise dating remains uncertain, a terrible epidemic swept through the empire. This disease, which many historians believe was smallpox, had traveled faster than the Spanish themselves, spreading along trade routes and human networks from the Caribbean and Central America, where Europeans had already established their presence. The sickness moved with awful speed through populations that had no immunity to it, and among its victims was Qhapaq himself, who died in the northern provinces along with his designated heir, a prince named Ninanquiuchi. The death of both the emperor and his chosen successor left the question of who should rule dangerously unclear, and this ambiguity would prove fatal to the peace of the realm. According to some accounts, Qhapaq expressed wishes on his deathbed regarding the succession, but these accounts disagree with one another, and the truth of the matter may never be fully established. What is certain is that Huáscar, in Cusco, claimed the throne as the son of the principal queen, and therefore the legitimate heir, according to one interpretation of Inca custom. And Atahualpa, in the north, found himself in command of his father's experienced northern armies, with generals who were loyal to him personally and who had spent years fighting alongside him. Whether Atahualpa initially intended to claim the throne for himself or merely to maintain autonomy in the northern provinces is debated, but tensions between the brothers escalated steadily, and within a few years, those tensions erupted into open warfare. The civil war that followed, spanning roughly from 1529 to 1532, was catastrophic in its scope and brutality. Modern historians estimate that somewhere in the vicinity of 100,000 people may have lost their lives in this conflict, though such numbers from this period are necessarily approximate. What is not in doubt is that the war tore through communities across the empire, dividing families and provinces, as different regions declared their loyalty to one brother or the other. This was not a distant conflict fought by professional armies in isolation from civilian life, but rather a struggle that reached into the fabric of Andean society itself. Atahualpa's military position was strengthened considerably by the loyalty of two particularly capable generals, whose names deserve mention here. The first was Sacsayhuamán, and the second was Qhapaq, both of them experienced commanders who had served Qhapaq, and who now placed their considerable skills at Atahualpa's disposal. These generals led the northern armies southward in a campaign that was efficient and, it must be said, extremely ruthless. They understood that to secure Atahualpa's claim to the throne, they would need to defeat not merely Huáscar's armies, but also destroy the networks of support that sustained his rule. Among the early engagements of this war was the massacre at Vilcabamba, a city that held personal significance for Qhapaq and where Atahualpa himself may have been born. The city had declared its loyalty to Huáscar, and when it fell to Atahualpa's forces, the consequences were severe. Soldiers and civilians alike suffered greatly, and the destruction served as a warning to other communities about the cost of supporting the wrong side. This pattern of exemplary violence would recur throughout the war, as both sides sought to terrify potential supporters of their enemy into submission or neutrality. The war moved back and forth across the Andean landscape, through highland passes, and along the great Inca roads that had been built to facilitate administration and trade. Huáscar's forces won some engagements, and for a time it seemed possible that the legitimate heir in Cusco might prevail. But the momentum gradually shifted in Atahualpa's favor, as his northern armies, hardened by years of frontier warfare, proved more effective than the forces Huáscar could assemble. The generals, Quisquis and Chalcuchima, drove southward with methodical determination, winning battle after battle, tightening their grip on the empire's central provinces. The decisive engagement came in April of 1532, at a place called Qhapaq, not terribly far from Cusco itself. Here, Huáscar himself took the field at the head of his army, perhaps recognizing that his cause was growing desperate, and that personal leadership might inspire his troops to greater efforts. The battle that followed was fierce, but its outcome was ultimately lopsided. Huáscar's army was shattered, and more significantly, Huáscar himself was taken prisoner, captured alive by his brother's forces. With the king in enemy hands, organized resistance largely collapsed, and Atahualpa's generals soon marched into Cusco itself. What followed the capture of Huáscar is perhaps the most difficult portion of this narrative to recount, and we shall speak of it as gently as the subject allows, acknowledging that history contains chapters of great sorrow alongside those of achievement and beauty. Atahualpa's forces, having secured control of the capital, set about eliminating any possible future challenge to their master's rule. This meant targeting not only Huáscar's political supporters, but also his family, in an attempt to remove any potential rival claimants to the throne. The methods used were harsh in the extreme. Huáscar's wives were killed, and so too were his children, including infants and young ones, who could pose no immediate political threat, but who might, if allowed to grow to adulthood, serve as rallying points for future rebellion. The killing extended to other relatives and supporters, a systematic elimination of an entire faction within the royal family. According to some accounts, these executions were carried out in such a way that Huáscar was forced to witness them, compelled to watch as his family was destroyed before him. The purpose of such cruelty was presumably to break his spirit entirely and to demonstrate to any remaining supporters that there was no hope of restoration. Huáscar himself was not immediately killed, but was kept alive as a prisoner, perhaps as a bargaining tool, or perhaps because Atahualpa had not yet decided his fate. He would eventually be executed, though the precise timing of this execution is intertwined with events that occurred after the Spanish arrival, which we shall discuss in due course. The order for his death came from Atahualpa himself, ensuring that his brother could never again pose a threat to his rule. And so, by the middle months of 1532, the civil war had largely concluded, with Atahualpa as the nominal victor. He had defeated his brother, captured the ancient capital of Cusco, and eliminated most of the rival faction within the royal family. But the cost of this victory was extraordinarily high, measured not only in the 100,000 or more lives lost, but also in the damage done to the empire's unity and administrative coherence. Provinces that had supported one side now viewed the other with suspicion and resentment. The networks of reciprocity and obligation that held the empire together had been strained and in some cases broken entirely. Experienced administrators and military commanders on both sides had perished, and the surviving officials were often more concerned with local survival than with imperial coordination. The empire that emerged from this civil war was, in short, a wounded thing, still vast and still possessed of considerable resources, but no longer the smoothly functioning administrative state that Qhapaq had ruled. The royal roads still crossed the mountains, and the storehouses still held their supplies, but the human networks that gave these physical structures their meaning and effectiveness had been badly disrupted. Loyalties were uncertain, grudges were fresh, and the new ruler, Atahualpa, had not yet had time to establish the kind of legitimacy that comes from years of successful administration and the performance of elaborate royal rituals. This, then, was the condition of the Inca Empire in the months following Qhapaq, when Atahualpa received word that strange visitors had arrived on the northern coast. These visitors, bearded men who rode upon large animals and wore metal garments, were led by a man named Francisco Pizarro, and they were making their way inland toward the highland territories. Atahualpa, fresh from his victory over Huáscar, resting at the hot springs near Cajamarca with a large army at his disposal, had no particular reason to view these newcomers as an existential threat. He had, after all, just defeated the forces of his own brother, who had commanded armies far larger than this small band of foreigners. The tragedy of timing here is worth noting quietly, as one notes a sad coincidence in a long story. Had the Spanish arrived 5 years earlier, they would have encountered an empire united under Huayna Capac, with its military and administrative systems functioning at full capacity. Had they arrived 5 years later, Atahualpa might have had time to consolidate his rule, heal some of the wounds of civil war, and establish firmer control over the entire realm. But they arrived precisely when the empire was most vulnerable, when its energies had been spent in internal conflict, when suspicions between factions ran high, and when the new ruler's legitimacy was not yet fully established. This was neither luck nor planning on the Spanish part, simply the way events unfolded. And so we leave the empire at this moment of transition, with one brother dead and the other newly triumphant, but presiding over a realm that was fractured in ways both visible and invisible. The children of the sun had fought against one another, and though a winner had emerged, the true cost of that victory would soon become apparent. But that is a story for another time, and for now, perhaps it is enough to rest with the knowledge that even great empires face moments of crisis, and that the events of those distant years, while sorrowful, are long since completed, their participants at rest, their struggles ended. And so we come now to a single afternoon, a few hours on a Friday in November, in the year 1532, when the trajectory of an entire civilization was altered in ways that would have seemed impossible only that morning. The town was called Cajamarca, a pleasant settlement nestled in a valley of the northern highlands, where warm springs bubbled up from the earth, and where the Inca Atahualpa had paused to rest his weary body after the long campaigns of civil war. He had no way of knowing, as he bathed in those soothing waters on the evening before, that the following day would bring the end of everything his ancestors had built across 4 generations of careful expansion. But we need not rush toward that moment, for the details of what led up to it are themselves worth understanding. And so let us settle into the particulars with the same unhurried attention we might give to any other matter of historical interest. Francisco Pizarro had arrived in the vicinity with a force that seems almost absurdly small when measured against the scale of the empire he intended to conquer. His company numbered approximately 168 men, of whom perhaps 62 were cavalry and the remainder foot soldiers, and they had brought with them 67 horses, animals that had never before been seen in these lands, and whose very existence would prove to be a factor of considerable significance in what was to follow. They also possessed several small cannons, called falconets, and a number of arquebuses, which were the cumbersome firearms of that era, requiring a slow and deliberate process of loading and firing, but capable of producing a noise and effect quite terrifying to those unfamiliar with such weapons. The Spanish had steel swords and steel armor, lances and crossbows, and the accumulated military knowledge of a culture that had been refining the technologies of warfare for many centuries. Against this small but technologically formidable force stood the army of Atahualpa, which by most estimates numbered somewhere in the vicinity of 80,000 warriors, though some accounts suggest the figure may have been even higher, spread across the valley and the surrounding hillsides in a display of military strength that must have been sobering, indeed, for the Europeans who observed it. The day before the fateful encounter, Pizarro had sent a small delegation to meet with Atahualpa at his camp near the hot springs, and this party was led by Hernando de Soto, an experienced conquistador who would later gain fame for his explorations of what is now the southeastern portion of the United States. De Soto rode out with perhaps 20 horsemen, and when they arrived at the Inca encampment, they found Atahualpa seated in a manner befitting his divine status, surrounded by his attendants and showing little apparent concern at the arrival of these strange visitors on their large and unfamiliar animals. The meeting was conducted through interpreters, and De Soto delivered an invitation from Pizarro requesting that Atahualpa come to Cajamarca to meet with the Spanish commander. Throughout this exchange, Atahualpa maintained a posture of studied indifference, barely acknowledging De Soto's presence and allowing long silences to stretch out before offering any response. De Soto, perhaps attempting to impress or intimidate the Inca ruler, reportedly rode his horse very close to where Atahualpa sat, close enough that the animal's breath stirred the fringe that hung from the royal headdress. But Atahualpa did not flinch or show any sign of discomfort, and it is said that those attendants who did react with fear were later executed for their display of weakness. Eventually, Atahualpa agreed to visit Pizarro the following day, and De Soto returned to the Spanish camp to report on what he had observed. That night, the Spanish soldiers waited in the town of Cajamarca with what we can only imagine was considerable anxiety, for they had now seen with their own eyes the vast size of the army encamped nearby, and they understood that their situation was, by any reasonable military assessment, quite hopeless. The town itself was arranged around a large central plaza, enclosed on three sides by long buildings with multiple doorways, and it was here that Pizarro conceived his plan. He would hide his cavalry and infantry within these buildings, their horses saddled and ready, their weapons prepared, and when the moment was right, they would emerge all at once in a sudden and overwhelming assault designed to create maximum confusion and terror. The plan depended entirely on the element of surprise and on the psychological impact of horses, firearms, and steel upon an enemy who had never encountered any of these things. It was a desperate gamble, but Pizarro had observed how Hernán Cortés had achieved similar results against the Aztec Empire just a decade earlier, and he believed that boldness and shock might accomplish what prudent military calculation could not. The morning of November the 16th dawned, and the Spanish took up their positions within the buildings around the plaza, waiting in tense silence as the hours passed. Atahualpa was in no particular hurry, for he was the Sapa Inca, the son of the sun, and the universe arranged itself according to his timing rather than anyone else's. It was not until late in the afternoon that his procession finally began to move toward Cajamarca, and what a procession it was. First came sweepers, clearing the road of any debris, followed by attendants in ceremonial dress, singing and chanting, and then squadron after squadron of warriors in their finest regalia, wearing tunics of brilliant colors and headdresses adorned with feathers and precious metals. The procession seemed to go on without end, a river of humanity flowing into the plaza, and at its center came Atahualpa himself, carried upon a litter made of gold and silver and adorned with the bright feathers of tropical birds, borne on the shoulders of 80 lords of noble rank, who considered it the highest honor to carry the divine ruler in this manner. Atahualpa wore the royal fringe across his forehead, the unmistakable symbol of his supreme authority, and around his neck hung a collar of large emeralds. He surveyed the plaza as he entered and noticed that it appeared empty, for the Spanish remained hidden within the surrounding buildings, and this absence of a welcoming party seems to have struck him as discourteous, though he gave no outward sign of concern. Into this scene now stepped a single figure, a Dominican friar named Vicente de Valverde, who approached the royal litter carrying a cross in one hand and a book in the other, either a Bible or a breviary, depending on which account one chooses to credit. Through the interpreter, Valverde began to deliver what was known as the requerimiento, a formal statement that had been developed by Spanish legal scholars to provide a justification for the conquest of non-Christian peoples. This document explained, in terms that must have been utterly incomprehensible to its intended audience, that the Pope in Rome had granted the Spanish monarchs authority over these lands, that the Christian God was the one true deity, and that Atahualpa was required to accept the sovereignty of the Spanish crown and the truth of the Catholic faith. It was a document designed more to satisfy European legal consciences than to communicate anything meaningful to the people against whom it was deployed, and one can only imagine how its convoluted theological and political arguments sounded when rendered through an interpreter whose grasp of Spanish was imperfect and whose conceptual vocabulary could not possibly have included adequate terms for Pope, or Trinity, or Papal Bull. What happened next has been recounted in several different versions by those who claim to witness it, and the precise details remain somewhat uncertain, though the general outline is clear enough. Valverde presented the book to Atahualpa, either handing it to him directly or showing it to him as evidence of the truths being proclaimed. Atahualpa examined this object, turning it over in his hands, and according to some accounts, he held it up to his ear, expecting perhaps that it would speak to him, for in a culture without writing, the notion that knowledge could be preserved in such an object must have been difficult to grasp. When the book remained silent, or when Valverde proved unable to explain to his satisfaction what this object was supposed to represent or what authority it possessed, Atahualpa is said to have tossed it to the ground, either in anger or in simple dismissal of something he did not understand or value. Other accounts suggest that he had difficulty opening the book, or that Valverde reached out impatiently and Atahualpa threw it down in response to this breach of protocol, for no one was permitted to touch the person of the Sapa Inca without his express consent. Whatever the precise sequence of events, Valverde reportedly turned and hurried back toward the Spanish positions, calling out that the Indians had rejected the word of God and that Pizarro should attack. The signal was given. By some accounts, Pizarro shouted the word Santiago, the traditional Spanish battle cry invoking St. James, and at this command, a cannon was fired into the crowded plaza. The effect was immediate and devastating. The explosion, the smoke, the sudden appearance of mounted soldiers charging out from the doorways on all sides, the sharp reports of the arquebuses being discharged, the flash of steel swords catching the late afternoon light. All of this combined to create a scene of utter chaos and terror among the thousands of Incas packed into that confined space. The horses, enormous and terrifying creatures that seemed to bear down upon the crowd like demons from some nightmare realm, trampled those who could not flee quickly enough, while the riders slashed downward with their swords at heads and arms and shoulders. The Inca warriors, for all their numbers and their courage, were armed only with clubs, slings, and bronze-headed axes, weapons that could make no impression upon Spanish steel armor, and they found themselves unable to mount any effective resistance against the onslaught. Those who tried to flee found the exits blocked or choked with the press of bodies, and those who tried to fight discovered that their weapons simply glanced off the armored figures who seemed impervious to any blow. The massacre, for it was nothing less, continued for perhaps 2 hours as the light faded from the sky, and during this time, estimates suggest that somewhere between 2,000 and 10,000 Incas were killed in the plaza and the surrounding streets. The numbers are uncertain because those who recorded them had various reasons to emphasize or minimize the scale of the slaughter, but all accounts agree that the killing was extensive and that not a single Spanish soldier died in the assault, though some received minor wounds, including Pizarro himself, who was cut on the hand while personally seizing Atahualpa. The capture of the Inca was itself a remarkable episode within this larger catastrophe. When the attack began, the lords carrying Atahualpa's litter refused to abandon their sacred duty, and as Spanish soldiers hacked at them with swords, severing hands and arms, other attendants immediately stepped forward to take their places, lifting the golden litter back onto their shoulders even as their companions fell around them. This continued for some time, with one group of bearers replacing another in an extraordinary display of loyalty and devotion, until finally the weight of the dead and the persistence of the attack brought the litter crashing to the ground. Atahualpa was seized and taken prisoner, and with his capture, the massacre gradually came to an end, for Pizarro understood that the Inca ruler was worth far more as a captive than as a corpse. As darkness settled over the plaza, now littered with the bodies of the slain, the transformation of the Andean world had begun. The most powerful ruler of the largest empire in the Americas, a man who commanded the loyalty of millions, and whose word was law from the borders of present-day Colombia to central Chile, was now a prisoner in Spanish hands. The 80,000 warriors encamped in the surrounding hills, stunned by the capture of their divine ruler and uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented situation, did not attack that night or in the days that followed. The moment when two worlds collided had passed, and nothing would ever be quite the same again in these high mountain valleys, where the children of the sun had once believed their empire would endure forever. In the high city of Cajamarca, in a stone room that would become perhaps the most famous chamber in all the Americas, the Sapa Inca Atahualpa sat as a prisoner of the Spanish forces who had so recently seized him from the midst of his own army. The events of that terrible November day in 1532 had left thousands of his attendants and nobles dead in the plaza below, and now the lord of the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere found himself confined within walls that had once housed Inca nobility during their visits to this northern provincial center. The room was not uncomfortable by the standards of imprisonment, measuring approximately 22 feet in length and perhaps 17 feet in width, with walls of carefully fitted stone that rose to meet a ceiling some 8 feet or so above the floor. It was in this room, during those first strange days of captivity, that Atahualpa came to understand something essential about his captors, something that would lead him to make an offer unprecedented in human history. an offer so extraordinary that it continues to capture the imagination of historians and dreamers alike. Even now, nearly 5 centuries later, the Spanish soldiers, Atahualpa, observed with the keen attention of a man who had spent his life studying the motivations of rivals and subordinates, displayed an almost feverish interest in gold. They touched it constantly, spoke of it with voices that rose in pitch and intensity, and seemed to value it far beyond its proper ceremonial and decorative purposes. In the Inca world, gold held deep spiritual significance as the sweat of the sun, the divine metal that connected the earthly realm to the celestial power of Inti himself. But it was not used as currency, and its value lay in its sacred associations rather than in any purchasing power. Silver, similarly, represented the tears of the moon, and both metals adorned temples and sacred objects throughout the empire as expressions of religious devotion and imperial magnificence. But Atahualpa, watching his captors with the careful assessment of a man who had successfully waged civil war against his own brother, came to recognize that for these bearded strangers from across the sea, gold and silver represented something quite different, something that drove them with an intensity that bordered on obsession. And so, Atahualpa made his famous offer, standing in that stone room and raising his arm to indicate a line upon the wall at the highest point he could reach while standing on tiptoe, which measured approximately 8 feet from the floor. He would fill this room, once, with gold objects, to that height upon the wall, if the Spanish would agree to release him and allow him to return to his throne. Furthermore, he promised to fill an adjoining smaller chamber twice over with silver, a quantity so vast that his captors could scarcely imagine how it might be accomplished. Francisco Pizarro, the expedition's commander, listened to this proposal with the calculating interest of a man who had spent decades pursuing wealth in the Americas, and he agreed to the terms, though whether he ever truly intended to honor his side of the bargain remains a matter of considerable historical debate. The agreement was drawn up with what formality the circumstances allowed, and thus began the collection of what would become the largest ransom in recorded history. The logistics of gathering such an extraordinary quantity of precious metal from throughout an empire that stretched more than 2,000 miles from north to south presented challenges that would have seemed insurmountable to any less sophisticated civilization. But the Inca administrative system, with its remarkable network of runners and its intricate record-keeping through the knotted strings called quipos, proved equal to the task. Atahualpa, though imprisoned, retained his authority as Sapa Inca, and his commands still carried the weight of divine law throughout the territories that acknowledged his sovereignty. Messengers departed from Cajamarca, carrying orders to temples, palaces, and storehouses throughout the empire, instructing priests and administrators to gather the golden and silver objects that adorn their sacred spaces and send them northward to secure the freedom of their divine ruler. The Chasqui runners, trained from childhood for their vital role in imperial communications, carried these commands along the royal roads at speeds that astonished the Spanish observers, covering distances in days that would have required weeks by horseback. Over the following months, which stretched from late 1532 into the middle of 1533, a remarkable procession of treasure-bearers made their way toward Cajamarca from every corner of the Inca realm. They came from the great temple of Coricancha in Cusco, carrying golden panels that had lined the walls of the most sacred shrine in all the empire. And they came from provincial temples and palaces where generations of Inca rulers had accumulated the precious metals that symbolized their connection to the divine. Perhaps most poignant among the objects that arrived in Cajamarca were the pieces from the famous Golden Gardens of Cusco, those extraordinary artistic creations that had represented the fullness of life in precious metal. There had been, according to the chroniclers who later recorded the accounts of eyewitnesses, golden stalks of maize with silver leaves and golden ears, and golden llamas with their young, and golden figures of men and women and children, all fashioned with such skill that they seemed almost alive despite being wrought from cold metal. There were golden butterflies and golden birds and golden fountains, each piece representing not merely wealth, but the artistic achievement of craftsmen who had devoted their lives to honoring the gods and their earthly representatives. The collection continued for approximately 9 months, during which time the room in Cajamarca gradually filled with an accumulation of treasure unlike anything the Spanish had ever seen or would ever see again. The objects arrived in all shapes and sizes, from small figurines that could be held in one hand to massive panels and vessels that required multiple bearers to transport. Temple decorations came alongside personal ornaments, and sacred vessels arrived together with the golden furniture that had graced the palaces of Inca nobility. Each piece that entered the room represented not merely its weight in precious metal, but the destruction of artistic and cultural heritage that could never be replaced. Though the Spanish soldiers who watched the chamber fill showed little interest in aesthetic or historical considerations when confronted with such quantities of their most desired substance. Among the most significant expeditions undertaken during this period was the journey of Hernando Pizarro, Francisco's brother, to the great temple of Pachacuti on the central coast. This temple, which predated the Inca conquest of the region and served as one of the most important pilgrimage sites in all of ancient Peru, was rumored to contain fabulous quantities of gold, and the Spanish were eager to add its treasures to the growing ransom. Hernando departed Cajamarca with a small force of cavalry and infantry, making his way westward over the mountains and down to the coastal plain where Pachacuti had stood for centuries as a center of religious devotion. The temple complex, with its massive adobe pyramids and its sacred oracle that had attracted pilgrims from throughout the Andes for generations, did indeed yield a significant quantity of precious metal, though the amount fell somewhat short of the extravagant expectations that rumor had created. Nevertheless, the objects gathered from Pachacuti, including decorations from the shrine of the oracle itself, added substantially to the ransom collection and further demonstrated the reach of Spanish ambition into every sacred corner of the Inca world. During these long months of waiting, Atahualpa adapted to the circumstances of his confinement with the intelligence and flexibility that had characterized his rise to power in the civil war against his brother Huáscar. He began to learn the Castilian language of his captors, picking up words and phrases with a facility that impressed those who observed him, and he came to understand something of Spanish customs and expectations through his daily interactions with the soldiers who guarded him. Perhaps most remarkably, he learned to play the European games of chess and dice, mastering their strategies and rules with the same analytical mind that had enabled him to outmaneuver his brother's forces on the battlefield. The Spanish officers who played these games with the captive emperor found him a worthy opponent, quick to grasp tactical considerations and patient in the development of longer-term strategies. These pastimes helped to fill the endless hours of imprisonment, though they could not dispel the underlying uncertainty that must have troubled Atahualpa as he watched his ransom slowly accumulate and wondered whether his captors would truly honor their agreement. The final accounting of the ransom, when at last the collection was deemed complete, revealed quantities that exceeded even the most optimistic Spanish expectations. The gold objects, when gathered and weighed, totaled approximately 13,000 pounds of precious metal, while the silver amounted to some 26,000 pounds, together representing a fortune of almost inconceivable magnitude by the standards of 16th century Europe. Modern estimates suggest that this treasure, if valued at current metal prices and accounting for the historical significance of the objects themselves, would exceed $100 million, making it by far the largest ransom payment in human history. But before the treasure could be distributed among the Spanish forces, the individual artistic objects had to be reduced to a more fungible form, and so the melting began. Indigenous craftsmen, pressed into service by their conquerors, were set to work with their furnaces and crucibles, transforming the accumulated artistic heritage of the Inca civilization into standardized bars and ingots of gold and silver. The process continued for weeks, as piece after piece was fed into the flames and emerged as anonymous metal that could be weighed and divided according to the established formulas for distributing conquest wealth. The golden gardens vanished into the crucibles, their delicate leaves and lifelike figures reduced to featureless bars, and the temple decorations that had inspired religious devotion for generations became merely so many pounds of precious metal to be allocated according to rank and contribution. It was, in its way, a second conquest, the systematic destruction of cultural memory that accompanied the physical subjugation of the Inca people. The distribution of the melted treasure followed the conventions that governed Spanish expeditions of conquest, with shares allocated according to military rank and the relative importance of various contributions to the enterprise. Each mounted soldier, whose horse and equipment represented a significant personal investment in the expedition, received approximately 40 pounds of gold plus a proportional share of the silver, while foot soldiers received half that amount in recognition of their lesser investment and arguably lesser military significance. The officers, of course, claimed substantially larger shares, and the Royal Fifth, that 20% of all conquest wealth that was owed to the Spanish crown was carefully set aside for eventual transport to Spain. Francisco Pizarro himself received a share commensurate with his role as expedition commander, including the golden throne of the Inca emperors, which weighed some 83 pounds and represented perhaps the most symbolically significant single object in the entire ransom. Yet despite the fulfillment of the ransom agreement, Atahualpa's fate had already been determined by forces beyond his control or understanding. The Spanish forces in Cajamarca grew increasingly anxious about rumors of Inca armies gathering to rescue their emperor, and voices within the expedition began to argue that releasing such a capable and intelligent ruler would inevitably lead to renewed resistance against Spanish control. A mock trial was convened, charging Atahualpa with treason against the Spanish crown, to which he had never sworn allegiance, and with heresy against a faith he had never professed. The proceedings bore little resemblance to genuine judicial process, serving merely to provide a veneer of legality for a decision that had already been made on grounds of military expedience and political calculation. On the 26th of July in the year 1533, Atahualpa was led from his prison to face execution in the plaza of Cajamarca, the same plaza where his attendants had been massacred on that fateful November day 8 months earlier. The original sentence called for burning at the stake, a fate that filled the Inca emperor with horror, for Andean religious belief held that destruction of the body prevented proper passage to the afterlife and the eventual reunion with ancestors that gave meaning to mortal existence. In these final moments, The Spanish priest who attended the execution offered Atahualpa an alternative, explaining that if he accepted baptism and conversion to Christianity, the sentence would be commuted from burning to death by garrote, a form of strangulation that would leave his body intact for proper burial. Atahualpa accepted this offer, receiving baptism under the Christian name Francisco in honor of his captor, and was then executed by the garrote, a metal collar that was tightened until it crushed the windpipe and brought death. Before his execution, Atahualpa had made one final request, asking that his body be transported to Quito and interred there with his maternal family, in the northern lands where he had been raised and where his power had first taken root during the civil war against Huáscar. This request reflected the complexity of Inca succession and family politics, for Atahualpa's mother had come from the Quito region, and his attachment to that northern territory had shaped his identity and his claim to the imperial throne. Whether this final wish was honored remains a matter of historical uncertainty, as various accounts offer different versions of Atahualpa's ultimate burial place, and the location of his remains continues to intrigue researchers and treasure hunters to this day. And so ended the life of Atahualpa, last independent ruler of the Inca Empire, in a provincial plaza far from the imperial capital of Cusco, where his ancestors had built their remarkable civilization over the course of nearly 3 centuries. The room filled with gold, that famous chamber, whose dimensions have been recorded in countless history books, stands as a symbol of the extraordinary wealth that the Inca had accumulated, and of the cultural devastation that accompanied its seizure by European conquerors. The objects that filled that room, each one representing the skill of craftsmen and the devotion of believers, were transformed into anonymous metal and scattered across the world, funding Spanish imperial ambitions and enriching families whose descendants would never know the origins of their wealth. But the memory of that ransom persists, a reminder of a moment when 2 worlds collided in a stone room in the Andes, and the course of history was altered forever, gently and irreversibly, like a river finding a new channel through ancient mountains. And so we come now to a quieter corner of this long history, though perhaps not quieter in its events, but quieter in the way we shall tell it, for this is the story of a kingdom that retreated into the green and misty valleys where the Andes descend toward the Amazon, a place of cloud forests and tangled vegetation, where the last free Incas maintained their independence for nearly 4 decades, from 1536 until 1572, resisting the Spanish colonial order from a remote stronghold that would eventually be forgotten by the outside world for centuries, lost beneath the jungle canopy until explorers of the 20th century rediscovered its ruins and brought its story back into the light of historical memory. The tale of this resistance begins, as many such tales do, with a young man who initially believed that cooperation might serve his people better than confrontation, and that young man was Manco Inca, whom we have met before in our telling, the prince who was installed as Sapa Inca by Francisco Pizarro in 1533, following the chaos of Atahualpa's execution and the various conflicts that had torn apart the royal succession. And Manco accepted this arrangement because he hoped, reasonably enough, that by working within the new order, he might preserve some measure of authority for himself and some protection for his people. And for a time, this arrangement seemed to function, if not happily, then at least with a degree of stability that allowed daily life to continue in some fashion. But the following years brought experiences that would transform Manco's thinking entirely. for he witnessed and personally suffered numerous humiliations at the hands of Spanish soldiers and administrators who treated him not as the sacred ruler of a great civilization, but as a puppet to be manipulated and abused at their convenience. And he saw his people subjected to demands for tribute and labor that exceeded anything they had known under the Inca system. And he watched as sacred sites were desecrated and as the entire social order that had given meaning and structure to Andean life was dismantled piece by piece. And gradually the young Qhapaq Inca came to understand that cooperation would not preserve his world, but would only hasten its destruction. And so he began, quietly at first, to plan a different course. In April of 1536, Manco Inca escaped from Spanish custody and fled to the UK Valley, where he began the work of raising an army from among his people, sending out messengers to the various regions of the former empire, and calling upon the loyalty that many still felt toward the institution of the Qhapaq Inca. And the response was remarkable in its scale, for within a relatively short time he had assembled a force that various sources estimate at somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors. A vast host that represented the accumulated frustration and resistance of a people who had endured 3 years of foreign domination. And with this army, Manco marched upon Cusco, the former capital of his ancestors, which was then held by a Spanish garrison of perhaps 200 soldiers along with their indigenous allies. The siege of Cusco began in May of 1536 and would continue for nearly a year, making it one of the longest and most determined indigenous resistance efforts in the history of the Americas. And during this prolonged confrontation, Manco demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation, for he studied the Spanish military techniques that had proven so devastating to indigenous forces and began to incorporate them into his own strategy, learning to ride horses captured from the enemy and training selected warriors in their use, and acquiring Spanish swords and lances and crossbows and even a few firearms, and learning how to employ these unfamiliar weapons with increasing effectiveness, so that his army became something new, a force that combined traditional Andean military organization with European technologies and tactics. And this hybrid approach made his resistance far more formidable than the Spanish had anticipated. During the siege, the Inca forces used heated stones wrapped in cotton and launched by sling to set fire to the thatched roofs of Cusco, and much of the city burned, and at several points the Spanish garrison came very close to being overwhelmed entirely, and there were moments when it seemed that the reconquest of the old capital might actually succeed. But the Spanish held on with desperate tenacity, and reinforcements eventually arrived from other parts of Peru, and the tide of the siege gradually turned against the Inca forces, who despite their numbers and their newfound adaptations, still struggled against the combination of steel armor and cavalry charges and the psychological impact of technologies they had only recently encountered. And by the spring of 1537, it had become clear that the siege could not be sustained indefinitely. Rather than accept defeat, Manco Inca chose strategic withdrawal, leading his followers away from the highlands and deeper into the forested valleys that descended toward the eastern lowlands, into a region known as Vilcabamba, which in Quechua means something like the sacred plain, though sacred plain hardly captures the nature of this terrain, for it was a landscape of steep ridges and deep gorges, of perpetual mist and rainfall, of vegetation so dense that paths had to be cut through it with constant effort, a place where the cloud forest created a world of green twilight and dripping leaves, and the calls of unfamiliar birds echoing through the valleys. And here, in this remote and difficult country, Manco established what historians now call the Neo-Inca state, a kingdom in exile that would preserve the institutions and ceremonies of Inca civilization for another 35 years. The capital of this jungle kingdom was also called Vilcabamba, a city built in a style that combined traditional Inca stonework with adaptations to the tropical forest environment. And here, Manco maintained a court that followed the old rituals and observed the old festivals and preserved the old social hierarchies, creating a space where Inca culture could continue to exist and where the memory of independence could be kept alive. And from this base, his forces conducted raids against Spanish settlements and caravans, emerging from the forest to strike and then disappearing back into the green maze, where Spanish horses and Spanish tactics offered little advantage. And for nearly a decade, this pattern continued, a persistent irritation to the colonial authorities, who found themselves unable to eliminate this pocket of resistance despite numerous attempts. But in 1544, an unexpected end came to Manco Inca himself, and it came not from a Spanish military expedition, but from within his own refuge, for he had given shelter to a group of 7 Spanish soldiers who were fugitives from their own people, men who had supported the losing side in one of the civil wars that periodically erupted among the conquistadors, and Manco had welcomed them into Vilcabamba, perhaps seeing them as useful sources of military knowledge, or perhaps simply exercising the traditional Inca virtue of hospitality to strangers. And for some time, they lived among the Inca court, seemingly grateful for the protection they had received. But then, during a game of horseshoes, a pastime that Manco had adopted from his guests, these men turned upon their host and murdered him, stabbing him repeatedly before being killed themselves by the horrified Inca guards. And thus the great leader of the resistance died at the hands of those he had sheltered, a death that carried its own particular sadness. The Neo-Inca state survived this loss, however, passing first to Manco's young son, Qhapaq, who was perhaps only 5 years old at the time of his father's death, and who would rule Vilcabamba for the next 14 years, though effective power during his minority rested with regents and advisors who maintained the policies of resistance that Manco had established, and the jungle kingdom continued its independent existence, conducting occasional raids and reminding the Spanish that not all of the Inca realm had submitted to their authority. But as the years passed and Qhapaq grew to adulthood, the Viceroy of Peru, seeking to resolve this persistent problem through diplomacy rather than military force, began to make overtures toward a negotiated settlement. These negotiations bore fruit in 1558, when Qhapaq agreed to leave Vilcabamba and accept Spanish sovereignty in exchange for estates, titles, and a substantial income, and he traveled to Lima, where he was received with ceremony and then settled into the life of a colonial aristocrat, converting to Christianity and marrying according to Spanish custom. And he lived comfortably enough until his death, just 3 years later in 1561. Possibly from natural causes though, some suspected poison, and his departure from Vilcabamba did not end the resistance there, for the kingdom passed to his half-brother Titicaca, who had no intention of following his siblings' path of accommodation. Titicaca ruled Vilcabamba for the next decade, from 1561 until 1571, and he proved a capable and cunning leader who played a complex game with the Spanish authorities, negotiating and making agreements that he had little intention of keeping, accepting missionaries into his realm while continuing to practice the old religion, maintaining the appearance of moving towards submission, while in reality preserving the independence of his kingdom. And he even dictated a remarkable document to a Spanish friar, an account of his father's rebellion and the history of the resistance that provides one of our most detailed indigenous perspectives on these events. And through all of this, he kept Vilcabamba functioning as a sovereign state, the last remnant of the empire that had once stretched from Ecuador to Chile. Titu Cuzi's death in 1571, apparently from illness, brought to power the last of the Vilcabamba rulers, Qhapaq Amaru, another son of Manco Inca, who had spent much of his life in the seclusion of the sacred house of the Sun Virgins, and who may have been somewhat unprepared for the political complexities he now faced, and his reign would last barely a year before the final catastrophe descended upon the Jungle Kingdom for the new Viceroy of Peru. Francisco de Toledo had decided that the time had come to end the Vilcabamba resistance once and for all, viewing it as an intolerable challenge to Spanish authority and as a symbol around which indigenous discontent might continue to coalesce. In 1572, Viceroy Toledo dispatched a military expedition of approximately 250 Spanish soldiers, accompanied by a larger force of indigenous auxiliaries, with orders to invade Vilcabamba, capture the Inca leadership, and put an end to the Neo-Inca state permanently. And this force pushed into the cloud forest, following the difficult trails that wound through the gorges and over the ridges. And though the Vilcabamba forces resisted, they were ultimately unable to stop the advance, and the Spanish reached the capital city to find it burned and abandoned. For Qhapaq Amaru had fled deeper into the jungle, taking with him his pregnant wife and a small group of followers, hoping to escape into the vastness of the lowland forests where pursuit might prove impossible. But the Spanish pursuit was relentless, and after several weeks of tracking through the jungle, they caught up with the fleeing Inca and his party, capturing Qhapaq Amaru and bringing him back to Cusco in chains. And there, in September of 1572, the Viceroy ordered a public execution that would serve as a final demonstration of Spanish power and definitive end to Inca resistance. And the scene that unfolded in the main plaza of Cusco, the great square that had once been the ceremonial heart of the empire, was witnessed by thousands of indigenous people who had gathered, perhaps compelled, but perhaps also drawn by the terrible significance of the moment. The accounts tell us that as Qhapaq Amaru was led to the scaffold, weeping filled the plaza, a sound of collective grief rising from the assembled crowd, and that the Inca raised his hand and the crowd fell silent, waiting to hear what final words he might speak. And he is said to have urged them to set aside the old religion and accept Christianity, though whether these words were truly his own or were placed in his mouth by Spanish chroniclers, we cannot know with certainty. And then the execution was carried out, and the last ruling Sapo Inca was dead, and with him died the independent Inca state that had endured for more than 4 centuries. Yet something survived even this ending, for among the people there arose a prophecy, or perhaps a hope clothed in the form of prophecy, that the Inca would one day return, that the Pachacuti would come again, and the world would be turned upside down once more, and the children of the sun would reclaim their inheritance. And this belief would persist through the colonial centuries, surfacing in various rebellions and movements, most notably in the Great Uprising of 1780, led by another Qhapaq Amaru, a descendant who took the name of the martyred last Inca. And though these later rebellions also failed, the memory and the hope they represented never entirely disappeared. As for Vilcabamba itself, the jungle gradually reclaimed the city after the Spanish departure, and within a few generations its location had been forgotten by all but local inhabitants, who had their own names for the overgrown ruins, and for centuries the lost capital of the Inca resistance remained hidden beneath the forest canopy, known to exist from historical documents, but unknown in its actual location. And it was not until 1911 that the American explorer Hiram Bingham, searching for Vilcabamba, was led to a spectacular ruin that he believed to be the lost city, but which was actually Machu Picchu, a different and earlier site. And the true Vilcabamba remained undiscovered until 1964, when the explorer Jean Savoy identified the correct location, a site known locally as Espiritu Pampa, where the remains of the jungle kingdom finally emerged from their long obscurity into the light of modern archaeology. And so the story of Vilcabamba comes to its quiet close, a tale of resistance and persistence, of adaptation and endurance, of a people who refused to surrender their independence for nearly 40 years, and who maintained their sacred traditions in a remote corner of the cloud forest, while the world they had known was transformed beyond recognition. And if their resistance ultimately failed in its immediate aims, perhaps it succeeded in something equally important, in preserving the memory and the dignity of a civilization that had achieved remarkable things, and in providing a symbol of hope that would continue to inspire their descendants through the long centuries that followed. And so we come now to consider the quieter rhythms of existence, the everyday patterns that shape the lives of those many millions who dwelt within the realm of the four quarters, the ordinary people whose days passed in a gentle succession of familiar tasks and seasonal observances, far removed from the golden splendors of Cusco and the political machinations of the royal court. For while the Sapa Inca and his noble relations moved through a world of ceremony and conquest, the vast majority of the empire's subjects, perhaps 10 to 12 million souls at the height of Inca power, lived lives centered upon community and kinship, upon the turning of the agricultural year and the enduring bonds of mutual obligation that tied each person to their neighbors, to their ancestors, and to the land itself. This was the lived experience of the Inca world, and it is here that we shall rest for a time, in the contemplation of these steady and sustaining patterns. The fundamental unit of Inca society was not the individual, nor even the immediate family in the manner we might understand it today, but rather a larger grouping known as the Ailu, a word that carries within it notions of kinship, of shared territory, and of collective responsibility that stretched back through generations and forward into the uncertain future. An Ailu might comprise several hundred people, all of whom recognized a common ancestor, often one whose origins had faded into the comfortable mists of mythology, and all of whom held certain lands in common, worked those lands together, and shared in both the burdens and the benefits of their communal existence. The Ailu was the basic building block upon which the entire Inca administrative system rested, and within its embrace, each person found their place, their obligations clearly defined, and their needs provided for through the cooperation of their kin. Within the Ailu, land was distributed according to need, with each married couple receiving a portion sufficient to sustain their household, a portion that would grow with the arrival of children and shrink again as those children grew and established households of their own. The concept of private land ownership, in the manner familiar to European societies, did not truly exist within this system, for the land belonged ultimately to the Ailu, which is to say it belonged to everyone and to no one in particular, held in trust for past generations who had worked it, and for future generations who would do so in their turn. This arrangement fostered a deep sense of interconnection, a recognition that one's own prosperity was inseparable from the prosperity of one's neighbors, and that the welfare of the community must always take precedence over individual ambition. The Inca state, in its wisdom, built upon these existing structures of mutual aid and reciprocal obligation, extending them outward to encompass the entire empire through a system of labor taxation known as mitia, a term that we might translate loosely as turn, or perhaps rotation, for it was indeed a rotating obligation that fell upon different groups at different times according to a carefully maintained schedule. Under the mythic system, adult men were required to devote a portion of their labor each year to projects designated by the state, and this labor might take many forms depending upon the needs of the empire and the skills of the individual worker. Some men were called upon to serve in the armies of the Sapa Inca, to march across the long roads that bound the empire together, and to fight in the campaigns of expansion that pushed ever outward against neighboring peoples. Others were set to work upon the great construction projects for which the Inca are justly remembered, the fortresses and temples and agricultural terraces that transformed the Andean landscape, the roads and bridges and storehouses that enabled the smooth functioning of the imperial administration. Still others fulfilled their mythic obligations through agricultural labor on lands set aside for the state or for the support of religious institutions, tending fields of maize and potatoes, whose harvest would fill the great kolkha storehouses that studied the landscape at regular intervals along the road system. These storehouses, numbering in the thousands and holding quantities of food and goods sufficient to sustain entire armies or to provide relief during times of famine, represented one half of the reciprocal bargain that bound the common people to the Inca state. In exchange for their labor, the state promised protection, promised order, and promised that in times of hardship, the stores accumulated through collective effort would be redistributed to those in need. This was an economy without money, without markets in the conventional sense, an economy of obligation and redistribution in which the central authority collected the surplus produced by millions of hands and redistributed it according to principles that, ideally at least, ensured that none should go hungry while others feasted. The diet of ordinary Inca subjects, while lacking the elaborate delicacies reserved for the nobility, was nonetheless remarkably varied and nutritious, drawing upon a wealth of domesticated plants and animals that represented thousands of years of careful cultivation and selective breeding in the demanding Andean environment. The potato, that humble tuber, which would one day transform the cuisines of distant continents, existed in the Inca world in a staggering diversity of forms, with over 200 distinct varieties recognized and cultivated, each suited to particular altitudes, particular soils, particular culinary purposes. Some potatoes were eaten fresh, roasted in the embers of cooking fires, or boiled in water drawn from mountain streams, while others were processed through an ingenious technique of freezing and dehydration into a preserved form known as chuño, which could be stored for months or even years, and reconstituted when needed to provide sustenance during lean times. Alongside the potato, the people of the Inca world cultivated quinoa, a grain-like seed of exceptional nutritional value that thrived at altitudes where other crops failed, and maize, which held a special significance beyond its mere dietary contribution, for from maize was brewed chicha, a mildly fermented beverage that accompanied every celebration, every religious observance, every significant moment in the life of the community. The brewing of chicha was primarily the work of women, and considerable quantities were required to meet both the daily needs of households and the demands of the state. which distributed chicha freely during festivals and to workers fulfilling their mythic obligations. Animal protein came principally from the cuy, the small domesticated guinea pig that was raised in households throughout the Andes. Its meat considered a delicacy, and its role in ritual divination, lending it an importance that extended beyond mere nutrition. Llamas and alpacas, those gentle creatures of the high pastures, provided not only wool for the textiles that held such value in Inca society, but also meat, which was often preserved through a process of salting and drying into a form known as charqui, a word that has come down to us in the English language as jerky, though the original was made from llama rather than from beef. For those who lived and worked at the punishing altitudes of the high Andes, where the air grows thin and the body struggles to perform even simple tasks, the coca leaf offered a gentle remedy, a source of mild stimulation and relief from the symptoms of altitude sickness that might otherwise have rendered life in such places insupportable. The chewing of coca leaves, often combined with a small amount of lime derived from burn shells or certain plant ashes, was a common practice among working people, a daily ritual that provided energy for labor and comfort during the long hours of toil. The coca plant was cultivated in the lower, warmer valleys and transported up into the highlands through the elaborate networks of exchange that connected the various ecological zones of the Inca world. And while the leaves were particularly associated with ritual and religious observance among the nobility, their use was widespread among ordinary people as well, a small pleasure woven into the fabric of everyday existence. Of all the products of human labor in the Inca world, none was more highly valued than textiles, those intricate weavings of cotton and wool that represented not merely practical necessities for warmth and modesty, but also the most precious form of wealth, more highly regarded even than the gold and silver that so captivated the later Spanish imagination. The production of textiles was primarily the work of women, who spent hours each day at their looms, transforming raw fibers into the cloth that served so many purposes within Inca society. The finest textiles, woven from the impossibly soft wool of the vicuña, a wild relative of the llama that roamed the highest grasslands, were reserved for the Sapa Inca and the highest nobility, and such garments were never worn more than once, being burned after a single use in a display of wealth and status that would seem almost incomprehensible were it not for our understanding of the central place that textiles held in Andean conceptions of value. Cloth served as offerings to the gods, as gifts to cement political alliances, as rewards to loyal servants of the state, and the ability to produce beautiful and complex textiles was a source of pride and status for women throughout the empire. The creation of skilled textile workers, among other purposes, was one function of a remarkable institution known as the ACLA system, under which young girls, typically around the age of 10, were selected from communities throughout the empire on the basis of their beauty, their skills, and their family backgrounds, and removed from their households to live in special establishments maintained by the state. These chosen women, as we might translate the term ACLA, received instruction in weaving, in the brewing of chicha, and in the various arts considered appropriate to their elevated status, and their eventual fates varied considerably depending upon their particular qualities and the needs of the state. Some became priestesses dedicated to the service of Inti, the sun god, living out their lives in the temples of Cusco and other major religious centers, while others were given in marriage to nobles or to men whom the Sapa Inca wished to honor, these marriages serving to bind distant regions more closely to the center of power. It was a system that might strike modern sensibilities as troubling. This removal of young girls from their families and their assignment to purposes determined by others. Yet within its own context, selection as an Akliawa was often regarded as an honor, a recognition of worth that elevated both the girl herself and her family of origin. The transition from childhood to adulthood was marked, for boys, by an elaborate ceremony known as Warachikui, which occurred around the age of 14 and involved a series of tests and rituals designed to demonstrate the physical and moral readiness of the initiate for the responsibilities of adult male status. The ceremony included periods of fasting, during which the boys proved their capacity to endure discomfort and deprivation, as well as competitive foot races that tested their speed and stamina, qualities that would serve them well in the demanding military service that awaited many of them. Upon successful completion of these trials, the boy received his first breechcloth, the warus that marked him as a man and from which the ceremony took its name, and he was thereafter considered ready to assume the obligations of the mythic, to marry and establish a household, and to take his place as a full member of his ailu. Among the nobility, the human body itself could be shaped to mark status and affiliation, for the Inca practiced a form of cranial modification in which the skulls of infants were deliberately shaped through the application of bindings and boards during the first years of life, when the bones of the head remained soft and malleable. Different shapes indicated different regional origins and noble lineages, and a properly shaped skull served as a permanent, visible marker of elevated status that could not be removed or counterfeited. The practice caused no harm to the developing brain, which accommodated itself to whatever container it was given, and adults who had undergone such shaping showed no ill effects beyond the distinctive silhouette of their heads. And so life passed for the millions who called themselves children of the sun, their days filled with the endless round of planting and harvesting, of weaving and building, of ceremonies that marked the turning of the seasons and the passage of individuals from one stage of life to another. Theirs was an existence shaped by obligation and by community, by the vertical landscape of the Andes, and by the long traditions of cooperation that had allowed human beings to flourish in so challenging an environment. And though the empire that governed them would prove fragile in the face of the trials to come, the patterns of life that sustained them would endure long after the last Supper Inca had passed from the stage of history. And so, as we come now to the final portion of our journey together through the story of the Inca Empire, we find ourselves considering not an ending at all, but rather a continuation, a persistence, a quiet and remarkable survival of ideas and traditions and memories that have refused to fade away despite the passage of nearly 5 centuries since the last independent Inca ruler drew breath. The empire itself, that vast administrative achievement stretching from the forests of what is now Colombia to the windswept reaches of central Chile, ceased to exist as a political entity long ago, and yet its presence can still be felt today in ways both large and small, in the languages spoken across the Andes, in the festivals celebrated each winter solstice, in the terraces that still cling to mountainsides, and in the faces of millions of people who carry within them the heritage of those who once called themselves the children of the sun. The colonial period that followed the Spanish conquest was, as we have discussed in earlier portions of our narrative, a time of tremendous upheaval and suffering for the indigenous peoples of the Andes, a time when old ways were suppressed and new systems of labor and tribute were imposed, when populations declined dramatically due to disease and exploitation, and when the memory of Inca rule took on an increasingly mythologized quality among those who lived under Spanish dominion. And yet, even during these centuries of colonial control, the idea of the Inca remained powerful, a symbol of a time before conquest, a reminder that things had once been otherwise, and might perhaps be so again. This symbolism found its most dramatic expression in the Great Rebellion of 1780 and 1781, led by a man who bore a name heavy with historical significance, and who sought to challenge Spanish authority in the name of both indigenous rights and the restoration of what he perceived as just governance. José Gabriel Condor Conqui was born in 1738 in the province of Tinta, in the highlands south of Cusco, and he was a man who occupied an unusual position in colonial society, for he was a curaca, a member of the indigenous nobility who served as intermediaries between Spanish authorities and native communities, and he traced his ancestry directly to Tupac Amaru, the last ruler of the Neo-Inca state of Vilcabamba, who had been executed by the Spanish in 1572. This lineage gave him both social standing and a profound sense of connection to the Inca past, and when he chose to adopt the name Tupac Amaru II, he was making a deliberate claim to represent the continuation of Inca authority and to speak for those who had suffered under colonial rule. His grievances were many, and his observations of injustice were keen, for he had witnessed the brutal conditions in the silver mines, the corruption of local officials, the heavy taxes imposed upon indigenous communities, and the forced labor systems that drained vitality from the people he considered his responsibility to protect. The rebellion began in November of 1780, when Tupac Amaru II ordered the arrest and execution of a particularly cruel Spanish official named Antonio de Aroga, and this act of defiance quickly sparked a much larger uprising that drew support from across a vast region of the southern Andes. At its height, the rebellion commanded a force of approximately 60,000 indigenous followers, along with some mestizo and even Criollo supporters who shared grievances against the colonial administration, and for several months it appeared that Spanish control over the entire southern highlands might collapse entirely. The rebels achieved significant military victories and besieged the city of Cusco itself, that former Inca capital that held such symbolic importance for both sides of the conflict. Tupac Amaru II issued proclamations calling for the abolition of forced labor, the elimination of oppressive taxes, and the creation of a new order that would provide justice for indigenous peoples. And his movement represented the largest and most serious challenge to Spanish authority that the Viceroyalty of Peru had ever faced. However, the Spanish colonial administration eventually rallied its forces and, with reinforcements and superior weaponry, began to push back against the rebellion, capturing town after town and scattering the rebel armies. In April of 1781, Tupac Amaru II was betrayed and captured, along with members of his family, and the Spanish authorities determined to make an example of him that would discourage any future challenges to their rule. The execution that followed, carried out in the main plaza of Cusco on the 18th of May 1781, was designed to be as public and as horrifying as possible, a spectacle of colonial power intended to crush any lingering hope of resistance. Tupac Amaru II was forced to witness the execution of his wife, Micaela Bastidas, his eldest son, and other family members and supporters before his own punishment began. The Spanish attempted to kill him by tying his limbs to 4 horses and driving them in different directions, a method of execution known as quartering. But according to accounts of the event, his body proved resistant to this torture, and he did not die. And so the executioner eventually beheaded him, after which his body was dismembered and the parts sent to different towns throughout the region as a warning to anyone who might contemplate rebellion. The brutality of this execution did not achieve its intended purpose of erasing the memory of Qhapaq Amaru II, but rather transformed him into a martyr and a symbol of indigenous resistance that would echo through subsequent centuries. When Peru gained its independence from Spain in the 1820s, the memory of the rebellion was invoked as part of the broader narrative of liberation. And when the 20th century brought new movements for social reform and indigenous rights, Qhapaq Amaru II was claimed once again as a figure of inspiration. In 1969, the military government of General Juan Velasco Alvarado in Peru undertook a program of land reform that sought to break up the large haciendas that had dominated rural life and redistribute land to peasant communities. And this reform was explicitly associated with the legacy of Qhapaq Amaru II, whose image appeared on government propaganda and whose name was invoked to connect the modern reforms with a longer history of struggle for justice. The agrarian reform law of that year was even dedicated to his memory, an acknowledgement that the grievances he had articulated nearly 2 centuries earlier still resonated in a society marked by profound inequality. Beyond the realm of political symbolism and historical memory, the legacy of the Inca civilization persists today in the everyday lives of millions of people across the Andes, perhaps most notably in the continued use of Quechua, the language that served as the administrative tongue of the Inca Empire, and that remains spoken by an estimated 8 to 10 million people across 5 different countries, including Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, and Argentina. Quechua is not a single uniform language, but rather a family of closely related dialects and varieties, some of which are mutually intelligible and others of which have diverged significantly over the centuries. And this diversity reflects both the original spread of the language under Inca rule and the isolation of different communities during the colonial and republican periods. Today, Quechua holds official status alongside Spanish in Peru and Bolivia. It is taught in some schools, it is used in radio broadcasts and government communications, and it remains the first language of daily life for communities throughout the highlands, a living connection to the pre-Columbian past that has survived despite centuries of marginalization and discrimination. The continuation of Andean agricultural practices represents another way in which Inca knowledge and techniques have persisted into the present day. The agricultural terraces that were carved into mountainsides during the era of Inca expansion remain in use in many parts of Peru and Bolivia, their ingenious design still effective at preventing erosion, managing water, and creating microclimates suitable for different crops. The technique of freeze-drying potatoes to create chuño, which involves exposing potatoes to the freezing temperatures of highland nights, and then pressing out the moisture over a period of several days, continues to be practiced in rural communities much as it was practiced centuries ago, producing a shelf-stable food that can be stored for years, and that provides essential nutrition during lean times. These are not merely quaint survivals or tourist attractions, but practical adaptations to a challenging environment that have proven their worth over centuries and that continue to sustain communities in ways that modern agricultural science is only beginning to appreciate and study. The annual celebration of Inti Raymi, the Festival of the Sun, that was once the most important religious ceremony of the Inca state, provides a particularly vivid example of how Inca traditions have been revived and transformed in the modern era. The original festival was suppressed by Spanish colonial authorities as part of their effort to eliminate indigenous religious practices. But in 1944, a group of intellectuals and cultural activists in Cusco organized a reconstruction of the ceremony based on historical accounts and ethnographic research, staging a dramatic reenactment at the fortress of Sacsayhuamán overlooking the city. This revived Inti Raymi has grown over the subsequent decades into one of the largest cultural festivals in South America, drawing approximately 200,000 spectators to Cusco each year on June 24th, the date of the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere, and featuring elaborate costumes, ritual performances, and symbolic offerings to the sun. The festival serves multiple purposes today, functioning simultaneously as a tourist attraction that brings significant economic benefits to the city, as an expression of indigenous cultural pride, and as a complex negotiation between historical memory and contemporary identity. The incorporation of Inca heritage into Peruvian national identity has been an ongoing process since the country's independence, one that has involved both genuine appreciation for indigenous contributions and the appropriation of indigenous symbols by non-indigenous elites. The national coat of arms of Peru features a vicuña, a relative of the llama that was sacred to the Incas and whose fine wool was reserved for the emperor, and the imagery of the sun appears frequently in national symbolism, echoing the Inca veneration of Inti. Museums in Lima and Cusco display Inca artifacts and tell the story of the empire as part of the national heritage, and archaeological sites throughout the country are promoted as sources of national pride and as draws for international tourism. Yet this celebration of the Inca past has often existed alongside discrimination against living indigenous people and the marginalization of indigenous languages and cultures, a tension that continues to be navigated and contested in contemporary Peruvian society. Archaeological research continues to expand our understanding of Inca civilization and to bring new discoveries to light, sometimes in dramatic fashion. In September of 1995, the anthropologist Johann Reinhard and his Peruvian colleague Miguel Zarach discovered the frozen remains of a young girl near the summit of Mount Ampato in southern Peru, at an altitude of approximately 6,300 meters. This individual, who has come to be known as Juanita or the Ice Maiden, was approximately 12 to 14 years old at the time of her death and had been sacrificed as part of the Qhapaq ritual, the ceremony in which children were offered to the mountain deities as part of state-sponsored religious observances. The freezing temperatures and dry conditions near the summit had preserved her body and the textiles and offerings that accompanied her to a remarkable degree, and her discovery provided invaluable information about Inca sacrificial practices, textile production, and the lives of individuals in Inca society. Additional Qhapaq mummies have been discovered on other high-altitude peaks in subsequent years, each contributing new details to our understanding of these ceremonies and the beliefs that motivated them. The Qhapaq Nyan, the Inca road system that once connected every corner of the empire, has received renewed attention in recent decades, culminating in its inscription as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2014. This designation was remarkable not only for recognizing the archaeological and historical significance of the road network, but also for the unprecedented international cooperation involved, as the nomination brought together 6 different countries: Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia, Argentina, and Chile, all of which share portions of the ancient road system. The project required years of collaborative research, documentation, and negotiation, and it resulted in the protection of hundreds of sites and road segments stretching across thousands of kilometers, from the northern highlands of Ecuador to the valleys of northwestern Argentina. The Qhapaq Nyan project also emphasized the involvement of local communities, many of whom maintain traditional knowledge about the roads and continue to use portions of them, and it has been cited as a model for international heritage cooperation that respects both scientific research and indigenous perspectives. Questions of repatriation and the ownership of Inca remains and artifacts have become increasingly prominent in recent years, as indigenous communities and national governments have sought the return of cultural patrimony held in museums and collections around the world. The remains of individuals, including Qhapaq mummies and other ancestral figures, raise particularly sensitive questions about the ethics of scientific study and museum display, questions that involve competing values of research, education, cultural sovereignty, and respect for the dead. Some institutions have returned remains and objects in response to requests from Peru and other Andean nations, while others have resisted repatriation claims, citing research needs or legal complications, and debates continue about the appropriate balance between international heritage institutions and the rights of source communities. These discussions reflect broader global conversations about colonialism, cultural property, and the responsibilities that contemporary societies bear toward both the past and the people who are its living inheritors. And so we see that the story of the Inca does not end with the execution of Atahualpa in Cajamarca, or with the fall of Vilcabamba, or with the suppression of Tupac Amaru's rebellion, but continues onward into our own time, carried in the languages people speak, the foods they eat, the festivals they celebrate, and the questions they ask about history, identity, and justice. The children of the sun live on in their descendants, in the terraces that still hold the mountain soil, in the roads that still wind through passes and along precipices, in the quiet persistence of traditions that have outlasted empires and outlasted conquest, and that continue, generation after generation, to be passed along, renewed, adapted, and remembered.